No lawyer, you are finished. My sister mocked me in the courthouse hallway, while my dad smiled in approval. I stood there completely alone. Then the judge spoke. She does not need a lawyer. Their high-priced attorney went pale and dropped his pen. Oh my God, look at her file. My dad clutched his chest and collapsed. My name is Lydia, and I am 33 years old. For my entire life, I was treated as the family disappointment. I was the boring paper pusher who never amounted to anything, while my younger sister Brittany was handed the world on a silver platter. But they had absolutely no idea what I really did for a living. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who severely underestimated your worth. The fluorescent lights of the downtown Chicago courthouse buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, sterile glow on the polished marble floors outside courtroom 4B. I stood completely still, gripping a single unmarked manila folder in my hands. I was wearing a simple tailored navy suit. It was unassuming, but sharp, exactly the kind of armor I needed for the battle ahead. My heart was beating a steady rhythmic drum against my ribs, but outwardly I projected nothing but absolute calm. The heavy double doors at the end of the long corridor swung open, and the loud echo of expensive heels clicked sharply against the stone floor. It was my younger sister Brittany. At 30 years old, she still walked as if the entire world was a runway constructed specifically for her benefit. She was wearing a custom designer suit that likely cost more than a reliable vehicle, her blonde hair styled into perfect, effortless waves. Flanking her on either side were my parents, Richard and Patricia, marching like royal guards protecting their most prized possession. Trailing just half a step behind them was Mr. Caldwell, a high-priced, arrogant corporate attorney whose tailored pinstripe suit and smug expression radiated pure condescension. As they approached the waiting area outside our designated courtroom, Brittany caught sight of me standing entirely alone. A loud theatrical laugh erupted from her throat, echoing off the high ceilings and drawing the attention of several bystanders waiting for their own hearings. "You actually showed up alone?" Brittany asked, her voice dripping with venomous amusement. "No lawyer, you are finished, Lydia. Just sign the deed over now and save yourself the embarrassment." She crossed her arms, leaning her weight onto one hip, looking me up and down with absolute unvarnished disgust. My father, Richard, did not even bother to look me in the eye. He turned his attention entirely to Mr. Caldwell, shaking his head with a heavy, dramatic sigh. "My eldest has always been stubborn and foolish," he muttered, his voice carrying easily across the 10 feet of space separating us. "She thinks her little administrative salary can fight my firm. It is pathetic, really." My mother. Patricia adjusted the heavy string of pearls around her neck, stepping forward with that familiar condescending tilt of her head. She looked at me, not with maternal concern, but with the irritated impatience of a woman dealing with a disobedient servant who had forgotten her place. "Stop being dramatic, Lydia," she commanded, her tone sharp and precise. "Surrender the property for the good of the family. Brittany needs this." The property she was referring to was my sanctuary. It was a beautiful, secluded mountain cabin I had purchased entirely on my own. Growing up, the dynamic in our household was impossible to ignore. If Brittany wanted a new luxury car, my father bought it in cash. If Brittany failed a college course, my mother blamed the professor and paid for a private tutor to write her essays. Meanwhile, when I achieved the highest honors in my high school graduating class, my parents skipped the ceremony because Brittany had a minor role in a local community theater production that same evening. I was the invisible daughter, tolerated only when I remained quiet and subservient. When I turned 18, my parents completely cut me off, financially furious that I refused to join my father's logistics company and instead chose to forge my own path. My refusal was viewed as an act of treason because it meant I could no longer be controlled. I had worked grueling hours, paid my own way through school, and built a life from absolute scratch. That cabin represented every ounce of my independence, every late night, and every sacrificed weekend. And now, because Brittany had managed to drive her heavily subsidized luxury lifestyle staging company into massive debt, my family had decided that my hard-earned assets were rightfully theirs to liquidate. Brittany's business was a vanity project from day one. She rented prime commercial real estate downtown, hired a team of personal assistants, and spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on imported Italian furniture to stage houses that rarely ever sold. When the market shifted, her complete lack of business acumen was exposed. But instead of letting her face the consequences of her poor decisions, my father chose to cannibalize my life to rebuild hers. They had filed a frivolous, aggressive lawsuit claiming that my cabin had somehow been purchased using family trust funds. It was a blatant lie, a fabricated narrative designed to tie me up in litigation until I ran out of money and was forced to settle. Caldwell had not just filed a standard dispute, he had filed a barrage of aggressive injunctions, attempting to freeze my personal bank accounts, place a lien on my vehicle, and subpoena my employer under the guise of asset discovery. It was a scorched earth tactic designed not to win on legal merits, but to financially suffocate me before the trial even began. My father was using his immense wealth to weaponize the justice system against his own flesh and blood. I looked at the four of them standing there, a unified front of entitlement and greed. They were so confident, so absolutely certain of their inherent superiority. They truly believed I was nothing more than a mid-level paper pusher, barely scraping by in a tiny cubicle. They had never bothered to ask about my career progression, never inquired about the long hours I worked, and I had never offered the information. Why share my success with people who only viewed me as competition for their golden child? Mr. Caldwell checked his heavy gold watch and smirked in my direction. Miss, I highly recommend you listen to your parents, he said, his voice slick and oily. If we walk through those doors, the legal fees alone will bankrupt a woman in your financial position. I have filed motions that will keep you tied up in discovery for the next 5 years. Sign the quitclaim deed now and we can all go home. Caldwell was a partner at one of the most ruthless litigation firms in Chicago. He was known for burying opposing counsel in endless, meaningless paperwork, draining their resources until they capitulated. He looked at me not as a person, but as a minor inconvenience standing between him and his exorbitant billable hours. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not point out the sheer hypocrisy of a family demanding loyalty while actively attempting to steal my home. I simply tightened my grip on the manila folder and maintained a neutral, pleasant expression. We will let the judge decide, Mr. Caldwell, I said, my voice quiet and steady. Brittany rolled her eyes, letting out a loud, exasperated huff. God, you are so embarrassing, she muttered, turning her back to me to complain to our mother about the uncomfortable wooden benches in the waiting area. The heavy mahogany doors of courtroom 4B finally swung open, and a stern-looking bailiff stepped out, calling our docket number. The air inside the courtroom was thick and solemn, smelling of old paper and polished wood. The wooden pews in the gallery were mostly empty, saving for a few law clerks waiting for other cases. I walked down the center aisle, my heels making soft, measured sounds against the carpet, and took my place at the defense table. I sat entirely alone, placing my single slim manila folder neatly in front of me. Across the aisle at the plaintiff table, the scene was entirely different. Mr. Caldwell signaled to an assistant who wheeled in a heavy metal cart stacked precariously high with thick black legal binders. The binders landed on the table with a loud, intimidating thud intended to demonstrate the sheer crushing weight of the legal machinery my father was bringing down upon me. Caldwell unpacked his briefcase with slow, deliberate movements, pulling out customized legal pads and arranging his expensive fountain pens, as if preparing for a theatrical performance rather than a legal proceeding. Brittany sat directly behind Caldwell in the first row of the gallery, flanked by our parents. She leaned forward, whispering something in my mother's ear that made them both laugh softly. Richard sat with his arms crossed over his chest, projecting the absolute dominance of a man who believed he owned the room, the legal system, and my future. The side door opened, and Judge Harrison, a distinguished-looking man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, took his seat at the elevated bench. The bailiff called the court to order, commanding everyone to rise. As we sat back, the heavy silence of the room seemed to press inward. The ticking of the large wall clock echoed loudly, marking the final seconds of my family's perceived victory. Judge Harrison opened the primary case file, adjusting his reading glasses as he scanned the preliminary documents. He flipped through a few pages, a deep furrow forming between his brows. He looked up from the bench, his gaze sweeping over Mr. Caldwell's mountain of binders and my father's smug posture before finally landing on me. I sat completely straight, my hands folded patiently over my single manila folder. The judge looked at my solitary stance at the empty chair beside me, where a defense attorney should have been sitting. A mixture of professional pity and judicial annoyance crossed his features. He leaned forward toward his microphone, his deep voice cutting through the quiet courtroom. "Miss," he began, addressing me directly, "this is a highly complex property dispute involving substantial corporate entities and trust claims. Before we proceed any further, I must ask you, where is your legal counsel?" "I am representing myself, Your Honor," I stated. My voice was absolute ice, cutting through the stifling heat of the courtroom. The words echoed off the high wood-paneled walls, carrying a weight of finality that no one on the opposing side was prepared to understand. I did not fidget. I did not look down. I maintained direct, unwavering eye contact with the man on the bench. Behind me, I could hear Brittany let out a sharp, obnoxious snort of laughter. Patricia shifted in her seat, whispering loudly enough for the entire gallery to hear that I was making a fool of myself. Mr. Caldwell leaned back in his expensive leather chair, crossing his arms with a self-satisfied smirk. He was practically vibrating with the anticipation of an easy victory. He opened his mouth, prepared to lodge some condescending objection about judicial time being wasted on pro se litigants who lacked the intellectual capacity to comprehend basic property law. But I did not give him the chance to speak. I took a deliberate step forward toward the microphone positioned at the center podium, gripping my single folder. "And I move for an immediate dismissal with prejudice based on this filing." I continued, my tone completely flat and devoid of the emotional hysteria my family had clearly expected from me. Dismissal with prejudice meant the case could never be brought to court again. It was a bold, aggressive legal maneuver for someone standing alone against a top-tier corporate litigation team. Caldwell actually chuckled out loud. He shook his head and muttered something to my father, who mirrored the arrogant gesture by rolling his eyes and adjusting his tailored suit jacket. They thought I was playing a desperate hand of poker with empty cards. They thought I was a cornered animal trying to buy a few extra days of breathing room before they inevitably stripped me of the only property I truly valued. I lifted the single unmarked manila folder I had been holding since I walked through the heavy double doors of the courthouse. I handed it to the bailiff who had approached the podium. The bailiff, a tall, imposing man with a stern expression, took the thin folder and carried it up the short flight of wooden steps to the judge. The stark visual contrast between my single document and the towering metal carts of heavy black legal binders Caldwell had wheeled into the room was almost comical. My family believed that power was always measured in volume and expense. They believed that throwing enough money and endless streams of paperwork at a problem would inevitably crush any resistance. They had never understood that true power requires precision, not volume. They were about to learn that lesson in the most agonizing way possible. Judge Harrison accepted the folder from the bailiff. He adjusted his reading glasses, sliding them further down the bridge of his nose. The courtroom was agonizingly quiet. The only sound was the sharp, crisp rustle of the thick parchment paper as the judge opened my file. I watched his face intently. For the first 2 seconds, his expression remained set in that familiar, rigid mask of judicial annoyance. He was a man used to dealing with frivolous motions and time-wasting disputes from people who did not understand the law. But by the 3rd second, the atmosphere in the room physically shifted, changing the very air pressure around us. Judge Harrison stopped breathing. His eyes widened significantly behind the thick lenses of his glasses. He read the first page rapidly, then flipped to the second page, his eyes scanning the paragraphs with sudden, frantic intensity. He read the summary sheet twice, as if his brain was struggling to process the reality of the words printed on the page. He looked up from the document. He did not look at me. He looked directly across the wide room at the plaintiff table. His gaze locked onto the arrogant corporate attorney who was currently polishing his designer watch with a small microfiber cloth. "Mr. Caldwell." The judge spoke. His voice was no longer bored or annoyed. It was laced with a strange mixture of absolute shock and profound professional pity. It was the tone a doctor uses when delivering a terminal diagnosis. Caldwell stopped polishing his watch. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a practiced, arrogant flourish, projecting total unearned confidence. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied smoothly, his voice dripping with condescension. "I assume we can throw this nonsense out and proceed with the summary judgment so my clients can reclaim their rightful property." The judge slowly shook his head side to side. He placed his hands flat on the wooden bench, leaning forward and staring down at the attorney. "Mr. Caldwell, she does not need a lawyer." The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. The smug, satisfied smile vanished from Caldwell's face, instantly replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. Behind him, my father. Richard sat up straighter, dropping his arms to his sides and frowning. Brittany stopped whispering malicious comments to my mother. The entire plaintiff side of the room seemed to hold its collective breath, sensing that the ground beneath their feet was suddenly shifting. "Give counsel a copy." The judge ordered the bailiff, his tone urgent and commanding, leaving no room for argument or delay. The bailiff took the secondary copy from my folder and walked over to the plaintiff table. He handed the document directly to Caldwell. Caldwell snatched the paper with a dramatic sigh of irritation, acting as though he was being forced to indulge a child's ridiculous finger painting. He aggressively flipped the document open, ready to tear apart whatever amateur legal defense he assumed I had cobbled together from frantic late-night internet searches. I stood perfectly still at the podium, watching the man who had threatened to completely bankrupt me read the first paragraph. I watched the exact moment his carefully constructed world collapsed into ash. The physical transformation was instantaneous and brutal to witness. The healthy flushed color completely drained from Caldwell's face, leaving his skin a sickening shade of pale gray. His jaw went entirely slack. The confident, aggressive posture he had maintained all morning vanished as if his spine had simply melted away. His hands began to shake violently. The tremor was so severe that the thick legal paper rattled audibly in the quiet room, echoing off the high ceiling. He tried to grasp this edge of the heavy oak table to steady himself, but his coordination was completely gone. His fingers slipped, and the heavy luxury fountain pen he had arranged so carefully rolled off the table. It hit the hardwood floor with a loud, sharp clatter that sounded exactly like a gunshot in the silent courtroom. He did not even look down to retrieve it. He could not look away from the page. "Oh my God!" Caldwell gasped the words tearing from his throat in a panicked, breathless wheeze. "Look at her file." He dropped the paper onto the table as if the pages were physically burning his hands. He took a stumbling, clumsy step backward, bumping heavily into his own chair. He looked at me not with his usual condescension, but with absolute, unadulterated terror. He looked at me as if he had just walked blindly into a steel trap that was about to sever his entire professional career and his freedom. My father slammed his heavy hands down on the table, furious at the sudden pathetic display of weakness from the man he was paying $1,000 an hour to destroy me. "What is going on?" Richard demanded, his voice booming with misplaced aggressive authority. His face was turning a dangerous shade of bright purple, the veins in his thick neck bulging violently against his starched collar. "Caldwell, what is this garbage? Put her in her place and get my house back." Caldwell could not even speak at first. He leaned over the table, grabbing Richard tightly by the shoulder of his custom suit jacket. Caldwell dragged my father down, forcing him to look directly at the document resting on the wood. Caldwell leaned in close to my father's ear, whispering frantically. I could not hear the exact words being exchanged, but I could clearly see the desperate, frantic movements of Caldwell's hands as he pointed repeatedly to the official seals, the corporate letterheads, and the binding signatures on the document. Richard squinted angrily at the paper. I watched him read the bold black text printed at the very top of the page. I watched his eyes track slowly across the financial declarations, the corporate ownership transfers, and the binding federal stamps that proved the document was absolute and undeniable. The purple, raging fury in my father's face evaporated in a single heartbeat. It was instantly replaced by a hollow, blank stare of total, absolute ruination. His mouth opened wide, but no sound came out. The man who had terrorized our household for decades, the man who had promised to use his immense corporate wealth to grind me into the dirt, suddenly looked small, weak, and entirely broken. Richard let out a strange, wet, choking sound. His hands flew up to his chest, gripping the expensive fabric of his shirt as he struggled to pull air into his seizing lungs. His knees buckled beneath his weight. He slumped heavily back into his chair, the violent impact rattling the heavy legal binders on the table and knocking several of them to the floor. He was hyperventilating, his eyes wide open and fixed blankly on the ceiling in a state of absolute medical shock. "Dad!" Brittany screamed, her voice shrill and panicked, as she jumped up from the gallery bench, completely abandoning her poised socialite persona. Patricia rushed forward, grabbing my father's arm, demanding loudly to know what was happening to her husband and her money. But Richard could not answer them. He could only clutch his chest and stare blankly at the total wreckage of his life. I remained perfectly still at the center podium, watching the beautiful chaos unfold exactly as I had planned. I felt no pity for any of them. I felt no remorse for what I had done. I felt only the clean, cold satisfaction of a closed circle of justice finally arriving. I had not yelled. I had not argued. I had simply handed over a single piece of paper and watched their entire toxic empire crumble to dust right before my eyes. What exactly was written inside that single manila folder? What specific combination of legal words could possibly break a powerful, ruthless corporate attorney in 5 seconds flat and send a tyrannical millionaire into severe physical shock? To understand the sheer magnitude of this financial destruction and exactly how a solitary, discarded woman orchestrated the complete annihilation of her own toxic family, we have to step back in time. We have to return to a lavishly decorated dining room table exactly 6 months earlier, where a single selfish demand started a silent war they never had a chance of winning. Exactly 6 months prior, the air inside my parents' sprawling suburban estate in Oakbrook was thick with the scent of roasted sage and expensive imported truffles. It was Thanksgiving, but the atmosphere in the formal dining room felt more like a corporate board meeting where I was the only hostile party. The dining table was a massive slab of polished mahogany, stretching 15 feet across the room, groaning under the weight of catered dishes that none of us had lifted a finger to prepare. Crystal wine glasses caught the light from the dripping crystal chandelier overhead, casting fractured rainbows against the silk wallpaper. I was seated at the absolute furthest end of the table, practically brushing against the swinging door that led to the caterers in the kitchen. It was the physical manifestation of my place in the family hierarchy. At the head of the table, my father, Richard, sat carving the turkey with the aggressive precision of a man who demanded total control over every aspect of his environment. To his right, my mother Patricia adjusted her heavy diamond bracelets and smiled benevolently at the true guest of honor. Brittany sat directly to our father's left, holding court as she always did. She was currently on her third glass of an absurdly expensive vintage Cabernet, gesturing wildly as she talked about her business. Elevate Lifestyle Staging was the name of her company. It was a vanity project entirely bankrolled by my father, designed to give Brittany the illusion of being a self-made entrepreneur without requiring her to do any actual work. The market is just begging for a more curated, bespoke approach to luxury living spaces, Brittany announced, taking a delicate sip of her wine. My new brand identity is all about synergy. I am sourcing exclusive textiles straight from Milan. My clients absolutely demand authenticity, and I am the only one providing it in the greater Chicago area. I chewed my food silently, keeping my eyes on my plate. I knew exactly what synergy and brand identity meant in Brittany's vocabulary. It meant massive unchecked overhead. It meant signing commercial leases she could not afford, and hiring teams of overpriced consultants to do the heavy lifting while she posted curated photos on social media. I listened as she rattled off buzzwords, knowing instinctively that the math did not add up. You do not source custom textiles from Milan for temporary home staging unless you are hemorrhaging cash. You are a visionary darling, Patricia cooed, reaching across the table to pat Brittany's hand. It is so rare to find someone with your level of aesthetic genius. The way you transformed the penthouse on Lakeshore Drive was nothing short of miraculous. I am telling all my friends at the country club they absolutely must hire you. She has the Wilson Drive, Richard added, pointing his carving knife toward Brittany in a gesture of profound approval. It takes capital to make capital. You have to spend money to project wealth and attract the right kind of clientele. I have always said that a brilliant mind should not be restricted by a petty budget. I took a slow sip of my water, fighting the urge to roll my eyes. The penthouse Patricia was raving about had sat on the market for 9 months before the developer fired Brittany and hired a traditional staging company. Brittany's aesthetic genius had involved knocking down a load-bearing wall without a permit to improve the flow of the space, resulting in a massive fine that my father had quietly paid off. The caterers entered silently, clearing the heavy dinner plates and replacing them with delicate porcelain dessert bowls. The scent of warm cinnamon and baked apples filled the room, but the mood at the table suddenly shifted. The jovial, congratulatory tone evaporated. Richard placed his wine glass down on the table with a heavy, deliberate thud. The mask of the proud father slipped away entirely, replaced by the cold, calculating face of a ruthless businessman who was about to execute a hostile takeover. He reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a single piece of thick, high-quality legal paper. It was folded neatly in thirds. He smoothed it out on the table beside his coffee cup, pressing the creases flat with the palm of his hand. Lydia. He said my name sharply, cutting through the soft background music playing from the hidden speakers. I looked up from my dessert plate, meeting his hard gaze. Yes. He slid the document down the length of the long mahogany table. It glided smoothly over the polished wood, coming to a stop precisely next to my water glass. I did not immediately reach for it. I simply looked at the bold black lettering printed across the top of the page. It was a quitclaim deed. It was a formal legal document designed to transfer the ownership of real estate, relinquishing all claims and rights to a property. And printed right there in the center of the page was the exact parcel number and address of my mountain cabin in Colorado. I need your signature on this immediately. Richard stated, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or debate. I have a notary waiting in my home office down the hall. I stared at the document, my heart rate picking up a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. I looked from the deed to my father, and then to Brittany, who was suddenly finding the rim of her wine glass fascinating. What is this? I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. Brittany's company has hit a temporary cash flow snag. Richard explained, waving his hand dismissively as if massive corporate debt was simply a minor clerical error. She expanded too quickly to meet market demand. It shows initiative, but it has left her liquid assets temporarily tied up. Her creditors are becoming unreasonable. We need to secure a bridge loan to carry Elevate Lifestyle staging through the next quarter. And you need collateral, I stated, finishing his thought. Exactly. Richard nodded, pleased that I was grasping the financial mechanics. Your cabin is fully paid off, it holds significant equity, and there are no existing liens against it. The bank will accept it as collateral for a commercial line of credit. Sign the deed over to the family trust, and I will have the lawyers process the transfer in the morning. We will bail your sister out, and everything goes back to normal. The sheer audacity of the demand hung in the air, suffocating and heavy. He was not asking for a favor. He was not asking for a loan. He was demanding that I surrender the only asset I owned free and clear to save a business that was doomed to fail. I looked at the quitclaim deed again. I thought about the grueling years I had spent saving every single penny to buy that small piece of land. I thought about the endless overtime, the skipped vacations, and the relentless discipline it took to secure a property entirely on my own. I reached out with my index finger and slowly pushed the document back toward the center of the table. No, I said. The single syllable dropped into the dining room like a live grenade. Richard frowned, leaning forward in his chair. Excuse me. I said no. I repeated, my voice calm and absolute. I am not signing over my property to cover Brittany's debts. I bought that cabin with my own money. The money I saved after you cut me off on my 18th birthday. It belongs to me, and it is not available to be leveraged for a failing vanity project. The silence that followed was deafening. Brittany finally looked up, her lower lip trembling as she deployed her most effective weapon. Her eyes filled with rapid, strategic tears. How can you be so cruel? She whispered, her voice cracking perfectly. I am your sister. I just need a little help to get over this hump. Family is supposed to help family, Lydia. Why do you always have to be so selfish? Before I could point out the massive hypocrisy of a woman demanding my house calling me selfish, my mother erupted. Patricia slammed her hands down on the table, rattling the fine china. Selfish is exactly what she is. Patricia hissed, her face twisting into a mask of pure venom. You are so unbelievably selfish, Lydia. You have always been this way. Just like when you threw a massive fit because we paid for Brittany's startup capital instead of your college tuition. You held a grudge for years over pennies while your sister was out trying to build an empire. I stared at my mother, letting the historical revisionism wash over me. Pennies. They had given Brittany $200,000 to lease commercial office space, while telling me they could not afford to co-sign a small student loan because it might affect their debt-to-income ratio. They had abandoned me to drown in high-interest debt, and now they expected me to hand over my life raft. You are just a boring paper pusher, Lydia. Patricia continued, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. What do you even need a mountain cabin for? You sit in a cubicle all day processing meaningless files. You have no ambition and no future. Your sister has a vision. She is creating art. She is building a legacy, and you are going to let her business collapse just because you are jealous of her success. It is not success if you have to steal my house to pay for it, I replied softly. Richard's face turned a dark mottled red. He stood up from his chair, tossing his napkin onto his plate. This is not a request, Lydia. He growled, his voice dropping to a dangerous, menacing register. You are going to sign that document. I have funded your sister's business through the family trust. If she defaults, the trust takes the hit. I will not allow my financial portfolio to be compromised because you are throwing a childish tantrum over a piece of wood in the middle of nowhere. Sign the paper now. I looked at the three of them. I looked at my mother, glaring at me with unvarnished hatred. I looked at my sister, hiding her smirk behind a perfectly manicured hand, playing the helpless victim. I looked at my father, attempting to bully me into submission, just as he did with his employees, his competitors, and anyone else who dared to stand in his way. I realized in that exact moment that there was no reasoning with these people. There was no logic or fairness that could penetrate their shared delusion. They did not see me as a daughter or a sister or even a human being. I was simply a reservoir of resources waiting to be tapped. I was collateral damage in the ongoing project to protect Brittany's fragile ego. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I calmly reached down and picked up my linen napkin. I folded it perfectly in half, and then in quarters, pressing the edges crisp, before setting it down neatly beside my untouched dessert plate. I stood up, pushing my heavy dining chair back, making a soft scraping sound against the expensive rug. I am leaving, I said, wrapping my hand around the strap of my purse. You will have to find another way to fund the staging company. I highly recommend bankruptcy. It builds character. I turned my back on them and began walking out of the dining room, making my way toward the grand foyer, where I had left my winter coat. I heard heavy, rapid footsteps behind me. Richard moved incredibly fast for a man his size. As I reached for the brass handle of the coat closet, he stepped directly into my path, blocking the massive oak front door with his broad shoulders. His face was inches from mine. The smell of expensive wine and cigars radiated off him. His eyes were entirely devoid of warmth, reflecting only the cold, calculating ruthlessness that had made him a millionaire. He leaned in close, dropping his voice to a chilling, quiet whisper that echoed loudly in the cavernous entryway. If you walk out that door right now, I will sue you for that cabin, Richard stated. His voice was no longer loud, but it carried a lethal, vibrating intensity that demanded absolute submission. I will use every single dollar inside the family trust to tie you up in litigation for decades if I have to. I have Caldwell on retainer. Do you understand what that means, Lydia? I will bankrupt you. I will drag you through the courts until your legal fees eat up your pathetic little salary and you have absolutely nothing left. I stood perfectly still, letting his threat wash over me. The massive crystal chandelier in the foyer cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting the deep lines of anger and entitlement etched into his skin. He was not acting like a father disciplining a child. He was acting like a corporate raider executing a hostile takeover. He was using his immense wealth as a blunt instrument, fully intending to bludgeon me into surrendering the only asset I owned. I glanced over his shoulder. Brittany had followed us out of the dining room. She was leaning against the arched doorway, leading to the formal living room, loosely holding the stem of her wineglass. A slow, highly satisfied smirk spread across her face. She took a delicate sip of her Cabernet, watching our father threaten to destroy my life with the casual entertainment of someone watching reality television. Patricia stood right beside her, adjusting her pearls and nodding in silent agreement. They were a united front, a fortress of toxic codependency built entirely on the foundation of my father's money and my sister's fragile ego. For 33 years, I had harbored a tiny, foolish sliver of hope that eventually they would see me. I thought that if I just worked hard enough, if I stayed out of trouble, if I remained completely self-sufficient, they would eventually respect me as an equal. Standing in that freezing marble foyer, looking at the three of them, that fragile illusion finally shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The clarity that followed was absolute and liberating. They did not view me as a daughter. They did not view me as a sister. I was merely a resource to be mined. I was collateral damage standing in the way of Brittany's unearned success. If my financial ruin was the price of keeping Brittany comfortable, they would pay it without a single second of hesitation. "Move," I said. It was a single word delivered with a terrifying lack of emotion. Richard narrowed his eyes, trying to gauge if I was bluffing. He was accustomed to people cowering when he raised his voice. He expected me to cry. He expected me to beg for mercy, or attempt to negotiate a surrender. I did not blink. I did not break eye contact. I reached for the heavy brass handle of the solid oak door and pulled it open, letting the biting, freezing wind of a Chicago November sweep into the pristine, overheated foyer. Richard stepped aside just enough for me to pass, his jaw clenched in furious disbelief. I walked out into the freezing night, pulling my wool coat tightly around my shoulders. I did not look back as I let the massive front door slam shut behind me, severing the final tie to my toxic bloodline. I walked briskly down the sweeping, circular driveway toward my car. It was an unassuming, mid-sized sedan, deliberately chosen to blend in, to project the carefully crafted image of a practical middle-class worker. It was the kind of my family mocked, the kind of car they believed accurately reflected my supposedly mediocre life. I unlocked the doors, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. The heater roared to life, blowing warm air against my frozen hands, but I did not shiver. My blood was pumping with a cold electric adrenaline. I sat in the darkness of the driveway for a long moment, watching the warm golden light spilling from the massive windows of my parents' estate. Inside that house, they were likely pouring another round of expensive wine, celebrating my departure and toasting to their imminent legal victory. They believed they had won. They believed I was running away to cry in my cheap apartment, terrified of the mighty Mr. Caldwell. I reached forward and tapped the sleek touchscreen on my dashboard, activating the secure, highly encrypted communication system I had installed months ago. The interface was military-grade, entirely incongruous with the unassuming exterior of the vehicle. I hit a single speed dial contact. The line rang exactly once before a sharp alert voice answered the call. "Lydia, it is late. Is everything all right?" "David," I said, shifting my car into gear and pulling away from the towering wrought iron gates of my childhood home. "It is Lydia. My father just threatened to bankrupt me. He is bringing attorney Caldwell in to file a frivolous lawsuit to seize my property in Colorado. He intends to use the family trust to bleed me dry in court." There was a brief, heavy pause on the other end of the line. "Richard actually threatened to bankrupt you?" David asked, his tone shifting instantly from casual concern to absolute predatory focus. "Does he have any idea who he is talking to?" "No," I replied, steering the sedan onto the dark, winding suburban road heading toward the highway. "He still thinks I am a low-level administrative assistant making $40,000 a year. He thinks he can intimidate me with billable hours. I need you to initiate a full operational financial workup tonight. Pull the corporate ledgers for his logistics firm. I want every tax filing, every hidden asset, and every offshore account. Then I want you to pull the complete financial history for my sister's LLC. Let us see exactly how much debt they are actually hiding behind closed doors. Consider it done." David replied, the sound of rapid, aggressive keyboard typing already echoing in the background. I will bypass the standard firewalls and dig into their mezzanine debt. If they are desperate enough to extort a family member for a cabin, their cash flow must be critically compromised. I will have a preliminary dossier on your desk by 6 tomorrow morning. If Richard wants to play a game of financial attrition, he picked the absolute wrong opponent. Thank you, David. See you tomorrow. I disconnected the call. The highway stretched out before me, a long ribbon of red taillights leading back toward the glowing skyline of the city. The audience would now realize the fundamental truth that my family was entirely blind to. I was not a boring paper pusher. I was not a fragile, subservient cubicle worker waiting to be crushed by a corporate titan. I was a predator who had simply been playing dead to keep the peace. But the peace was officially broken, and I was done hiding. The screen of my old life faded to black on that miserable Thanksgiving night and opened to the blinding bright sunrise of the following morning. The scene shifted dramatically from the quiet, wealthy suburbs of Oak Brook to the chaotic, roaring heart of downtown Chicago. The morning commute was a sea of yellow taxis and rushing pedestrians, but I moved above it all. I drove my unassuming sedan into the highly secured underground parking garage of a towering 70-story skyscraper composed entirely of sleek black glass and steel. I did not park in the visitor section or the general employee lot. I bypassed the standard security gates, entirely swiping a specialized encrypted black keycard that granted me exclusive access to the restricted executive parking tier. I stepped out of my car. Gone was the submissive daughter from the night before. I was wearing a sharply tailored charcoal suit that radiated authority, my posture impeccable. I walked toward the private elevator bank. The armed security guards stationed at the desk immediately stood up straighter as I approached, offering respectful, deferential nods. "Good morning, Mom," one of them murmured, pressing the call button for me before I even had to ask. I stepped into the glass-walled elevator and scanned my fingerprint on the biometric reader, pressing the button for the top floor. As the elevator shot upward, leaving the street level and the noise of the city far below, I looked out over the sprawling Chicago skyline. My father believed he owned the world because he ran a mid-sized regional logistics company. He believed his wealth made him untouchable. He had absolutely no idea that his invisible, discarded daughter held the keys to a kingdom he could not even begin to comprehend. The doors glided open with a soft chime, welcoming me into my actual reality. The brushed steel doors slid apart seamlessly, revealing the sprawling top floor of Vanguard Acquisitions. The reception area was an expansive study in minimalist intimidation, featuring dark slate floors, frosted glass walls, and a massive custom-built reception desk carved from a single block of black marble. The Vanguard logo, a sharp geometric crest, was embossed silently into the wall behind it. I did not work in a cramped gray cubicle sorting through meaningless paperwork, as my mother so viciously claimed. I owned the entire building. Vanguard Acquisitions was an elite, specialized corporate restructuring and distressed debt acquisition firm. We did not just manage money. We dismantled failing empires, stripped them down to the studs, and liquidated the remains. I was the chief executive officer and the majority partner. I had built this firm from a tiny two-person operation into a ruthless corporate machine that handled billions in distressed assets. As I walked down the main corridor, the ambient noise of ringing phones and low conversations instantly hushed. Junior analysts and senior portfolio managers alike stepped aside, offering polite, deferential greetings. They knew me not as the quiet, invisible daughter of a regional logistics manager, but as the most terrifyingly effective closer in the Chicago financial district. I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the primary executive conference room. The space was dominated by a 20-foot-long custom walnut table overlooking the city through panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows. My business partner David was already there. David was a former forensic accountant for the federal government, a man who could look at a single tax return and completely deconstruct a corporate conspiracy. He was standing at the head of the table. His suit jacket discarded, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. The entire surface of the massive table was covered in printed financial ledgers, bank statements, corporate tax filings, and highlighted wire transfer receipts. The digital displays on the walls showed complex, interconnected web charts mapping out the entire financial architecture of my father's logistics firm and my sister's staging company. David looked up as I entered, his expression grim and completely devoid of his usual morning humor. "You were right to have me pull the records, Lydia," he said, his voice tight with professional disbelief. "I have spent the last 8 hours tearing apart their corporate structures. It is not just bad management, it is an absolute massacre." I walked over to the table, picking up a highlighted bank statement. "Show me," I commanded. David tapped a laser pointer against the digital display, mapping out Elevate Lifestyle Staging. "Your sister is not just a terrible business owner, Lydia. She is an active criminal. I tracked the capital injections from your father's logistics firm into her staging company. I was feeding her roughly $50,000 a month to keep the doors open. But the staging company has virtually no operating expenses. She is not sourcing luxury textiles from Milan. She is not paying a massive staff." David slid a stack of wire transfer receipts across the polished wood. "She has set up shell vendors, fake consulting firms, and phantom supply chains registered to offshore holding companies. As soon as your father transfers the operating capital into her business account, she immediately funnels it out through these fake vendors to cover her tracks. She is using corporate funds to pay for her personal luxury cars, her designer clothing shopping sprees in Paris, and her high-end country club memberships. She is actively embezzling from your father's company to fund her manufactured socialite lifestyle." I stared at the documents, the hard proof of Brittany's sociopathic greed laid out in black and white. She was bleeding him dry, and he was too blinded by his own narcissism and blatant favoritism to even check the ledgers. But that is only the first layer of the rot. David continued, moving to the other side of the table and pulling up a new financial chart. "Your father has been covering her tracks for years, but a regional logistics firm cannot sustain that level of constant, unchecked capital drain. To keep up appearances and fund Brittany's relentless theft, Richard has been quietly drowning. His core business has been completely underwater for at least 3 years. His profit margins are entirely fictional. He has been manipulating the quarterly earnings reports to keep his standard investors in the dark." I frowned, leaning over the table to inspect the debt ratios. If his traditional lines of credit are maxed out, how is he keeping the lights on? David let out a heavy, bitter sigh. He got desperate. When the traditional banks cut him off, he went looking for shadow capital. He took out massive, high-interest loans from a predatory private equity group known as Obsidian Capital. They are sharks, Lydia. They lend money to dying companies at extortionate interest rates specifically, so they can seize the assets when the company inevitably defaults. Richard took millions from them to plug the holes Brittany was blowing in the hull of his ship. I looked at David, the pieces rapidly clicking into place. Obsidian Capital does not hand out millions in unsecured debt without a rock-solid guarantee. What did he leverage? What did he put up as collateral to secure those loans? David's face turned the color of ash. He did not use his commercial real estate. He did not use his fleet of delivery trucks. They were already leveraged to the breaking point. David reached down and picked up a single heavily redacted federal filing. He used his employees. Richard illegally transferred the entire corporate pension fund, the retirement savings of every single warehouse worker, truck driver, and administrative assistant, who spent their lives building his company, into a high-risk, collateralized holding account. He pledged the pension fund to Obsidian Capital to secure the bridge loans. It is a massive breach of fiduciary duty. It is textbook federal fraud. If he defaults, Obsidian takes the entire pension fund, and hundreds of innocent people lose their life savings. I stood perfectly still, the cold reality of my father's absolute moral bankruptcy washing over me. He had not just threatened me, he had risked the lives and futures of hundreds of innocent working-class families just to protect the illusion of his own wealth and to fund his golden child's designer wardrobe. The level of sociopathic entitlement was staggering. He had literally gambled with the livelihoods of the very people who had built his logistics empire from the ground up. He viewed his employees the exact same way he viewed me. We were entirely disposable. We were nothing more than stepping stones meant to support the fragile house of cards he had built to appease Brittany. David looked at me, his eyes grave and urgent. Obsidian Capital is done playing games, Lydia, he stated firmly. Richard missed his last 2 premium payments. The predatory lender has officially initiated the default process. They are preparing to execute a hostile foreclosure on your father's entire corporate structure in exactly 30 days. David tapped a final document on the table outlining the foreclosure terms. He did not demand your mountain cabin last night out of spite or greed. He demanded it because he is absolutely terrified. He needs the equity from your property to make a balloon payment to Obsidian. He needs your cabin to save himself from federal prison. The silence in the conference room was absolute, broken only by the low hum of the servers and the distant muted sounds of morning traffic far below the skyscraper. I looked down at the financial wreckage of the people who had treated me like garbage for 33 years. I did not feel shock. I did not feel grief. I felt a slow, freezing wave of pure, unadulterated power. They had spent their entire lives mocking me, underestimating me, and treating me as an afterthought. They had laughed at my independence and sneered at my career. They had threatened to ruin me simply because I refused to lie down and let them trample over me. Now the very existence of their entire fraudulent reality was sitting neatly in a stack of papers on my conference room table. My father had promised to bankrupt me if I did not surrender my home. He had promised to unleash his high-priced lawyers to tie me up in litigation. He did not realize that I was the one holding the blade. I looked up at David and a sharp, dangerous smile spread across my face. Get me the acquisition paperwork for Obsidian Capital. I instructed, my voice ringing with absolute chilling authority. If they want to foreclose on my family, they are going to have to go through me first. Because Vanguard Acquisitions is about to buy that debt. I am going to legally own my father's entire existence. David stared at me across the massive walnut table, his eyes widening as the absolute magnitude of my command fully registered in his mind. You want to buy the paper? He clarified, his voice dropping to a hushed, completely serious register. Lydia, if we purchase that debt directly, Vanguard becomes the primary creditor. We inherit the messy pension collateral. Obsidian Capital is a snake pit. They are ruthless operators. They will want 80 cents on the dollar for a portfolio that is essentially a federal crime scene waiting to happen. I walked slowly around the edge of the conference table, trailing my fingertips along the polished wood. I do not care what Obsidian wants, David. I care about what they fear. They are a predatory private equity firm operating entirely in the shadows. They thrive on quiet, rapid liquidations, not highly publicized federal investigations. If Richard defaults next week, and Obsidian tries to seize that illegally leveraged pension fund, the Department of Labor and the Securities and Exchange Commission will swarm them. They will be tied up in brutal government audits for the next decade. Obsidian knows this debt is toxic waste. They are desperate to offload it before the bomb detonates. We are going to do them a massive favor. I stopped at the head of the table, leaning forward and planting my hands flat on the glass surface of the digital display. But we are not going to use Vanguard Acquisitions. Richard knows I work in the financial district, even if he firmly believes I am just fetching coffee and filing meaningless paperwork. If he sees Vanguard's name on the creditor transfer, he might panic and attempt to file for emergency bankruptcy protection to stall the foreclosure process. We need absolute stealth. We use Apex Holdings. David nodded, a slow, appreciative smile spreading across his face. Apex Holdings was our most heavily armored corporate shell company. It was an anonymous entity registered in Delaware, buried under layers of impenetrable non-disclosure agreements and blind trusts. It was the perfect ghost ship for executing a hostile takeover without leaving a single identifiable fingerprint. Prepare the acquisition strategy immediately. I instructed, my voice cold and precise. Offer Obsidian 30 cents on the dollar. Tell them Apex Holdings specializes in acquiring high-risk toxic portfolios, and we are willing to take the pension fund liability off their hands today. Cash transaction. Clean break. They will take the deal because it guarantees them an immediate exit from a federal nightmare. The execution of the maneuver took less than 4 hours. It was an absolute masterclass in aggressive corporate maneuvering. I sat in my corner office watching the sprawling Chicago skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows while David coordinated the strike from the main trading floor. I listened quietly through the open intercom as my specialized acquisitions team engaged Obsidian's senior representatives. The initial pushback was exactly as predicted. Obsidian demanded 60 cents on the dollar, blustering loudly about the underlying value of Richard's commercial logistics fleet and the massive equity in his Oak Brook estate. David countered with surgical, lethal precision. He casually dropped heavily researched hints about the imminent federal exposure regarding the illegally leveraged employee pension fund. He made it abundantly clear that Apex Holdings knew exactly how radioactive the portfolio was, and that we were their only viable exit strategy. The aggressive bluster from Obsidian instantly evaporated. The terrified silence on the other end of the secure conference call was palpable. At exactly 2 in the afternoon, the final digital signatures were processed. I watched the encrypted confirmation flash across my dual monitors. A wire transfer of several $1 million was authorized from Vanguard's reserve accounts, routing through the Apex shell and filtering silently into Obsidian's offshore holding banks. It was done. The transaction was finalized, stamped, and permanently logged in the Federal Registry. David walked into my office a few minutes later, holding a thick leather-bound dossier. He did not say a single word. He simply placed the heavy file directly in the center of my pristine glass desk. I reached out and flipped open the cover. I spent the next hour reading through the newly acquired asset portfolio. The sheer scope of my sudden ownership was staggering. Apex Holdings now held the primary lien on Richard's entire commercial logistics fleet. We held the master mortgage on the sprawling Oak Brook mansion where I had been threatened just the night before. We held the titles to my mother's luxury vehicles, the expensive country club memberships, and the vacation properties. We even held the outstanding commercial debt for Elevate Lifestyle staging Britney's pathetic fraudulent vanity project. They were completely and entirely mine. Every asset, every bank account, every single brick of their carefully curated wealthy facade belonged to the daughter they had relentlessly mocked and discarded. They had sat at that mahogany dining table dripping with unearned arrogance, threatening to bankrupt me over a tiny mountain cabin. They had no idea that while they were sleeping off their expensive wine, I had simply bought their entire world at a steep discount. They were completely oblivious to the fact that the ground beneath their feet was already gone. They were living in a house they no longer owned, driving cars they no longer possessed, and running businesses that belonged entirely to me. I closed the heavy leather dossier and pushed it aside. A profound sense of cold, clean justice settled deep into my chest. There was no rage left in me. The burning anger that had fueled me through the dark, lonely years of my early 20s had burned out completely, replaced by absolute clinical precision. I was not going to scream at them. I was not going to engage in another pointless, toxic screaming match in the foyer of their mansion. I was going to dismantle their empire the exact same way they had tried to destroy me. Legally, systematically, and without a single shred of mercy. I pulled a stack of blank Vanguard stationery toward me and selected a heavy silver fountain pen from my desk drawer. It was time to initiate the formal shift. I drafted the official notice of default. I did not delegate this crucial task to my legal team. I wanted to write the words myself. I detailed the immediate acceleration of all outstanding debts held by the logistics firm and the family trust. Because Richard had already missed his premium payments to Obsidian, the specific clauses of the commercial loan allowed for immediate total collection. The 30-day grace period was a courtesy that Apex Holdings was formally declining to extend. The legal phrasing flowed effortlessly onto the crisp white paper. I demanded full payment of the entire principal balance within 48 hours. Failure to remit the funds would result in the immediate seizure of all collateralized assets. That meant the logistics firm would be completely locked down, the corporate bank accounts frozen, and the Oak Brook estate slated for immediate public auction. It was a flawless, unavoidable trap. Richard did not have the cash. He had squandered it all covering Britney's blatant embezzlement and maintaining a fraudulent lifestyle he could not afford. When this notice arrived by certified courier tomorrow morning, the illusion would shatter permanently. He would have to look my mother and my sister in the eye and confess that he had gambled away everything they possessed. He would have to admit that he was a total failure. I signed my name at the bottom of the document, pressing the sharp nib of the fountain pen firmly into the heavy paper. Lydia Vance, Chief Executive Officer. I slid the document into a thick crimson envelope and sealed it tight. I felt a deep, resounding sense of closure. The toxic family structure that had suffocated me for my entire life was officially dismantled. I had severed the puppet strings forever. Just as I placed the sealed envelope in my outgoing tray, preparing to hand it to my executive courier, the sharp, sterile buzz of my private office intercom shattered the quiet atmosphere of the room. I reached over and pressed the flashing silver button. Yes, Sarah. Lydia. My receptionist's voice echoed loudly through the speaker. She sounded uncharacteristically panicked, her usual polished professional tone completely abandoned. I am so sorry to interrupt you. What is the situation, Sarah? I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. There are two women down in the main lobby. Sarah said, her words rushing out in a frantic, breathless hurry. They bypassed the standard visitor screening and tried to force their way into the private executive elevator bank. They are currently screaming at the armed security guards, demanding to be led up to the top floor. I frowned, leaning closer to the intercom. Who are they? Sarah hesitated, taking a shaky breath. They are claiming to be your mother and your sister Lydia, and they are completely hysterical. They are telling the guards that you stole Brittany's car. I pressed the intercom button, my finger hovering over the polished metal. Do not correct them, Sarah. I instructed, keeping my voice dangerously calm. Do not utter the words Chief Executive Officer. Tell Marcus and the rest of the security detail to stand down and let them vent. Do not intervene unless they become physically violent. I am coming down to the lobby right now. I released the button and stood up from my massive glass desk. The accusation about a stolen car was so profoundly absurd, it was almost beautiful in its malice. I drove a highly practical 5-year-old sedan that I had bought in cash. Brittany drove a leased luxury SUV that my father paid for every month. She was fabricating a grand theft auto felony out of thin air simply to guarantee maximum public humiliation. She wanted to ensure I was fired from what she assumed was my entry-level secretarial job. She wanted me completely destitute before the lawsuit even began. I walked out of my office and stepped into the private executive elevator. As the glass cab descended through the central core of the skyscraper, I took a deep breath and adjusted my posture. I rolled my shoulders forward. I let my spine droop slightly. I wiped the cold, predatory confidence completely off my face and replaced it with wide-eyed, frantic anxiety. I needed them to believe they had the absolute upper hand. I needed them to commit entirely to their own destruction. By the time the elevator reached the ground floor, I was no longer the ruthless corporate raider who had just bought their entire financial existence. I was Lydia, the terrified paper pusher. The elevator doors slid open, revealing the sprawling Vanguard Acquisitions lobby. The space was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation, featuring stark black marble flooring and towering frosted glass walls. Standing directly in the center of the pristine floor, acting like feral animals, were my mother and my sister. I demand you call the police this instant, Brittany shrieked, slamming her expensive designer handbag against the polished stone of the reception desk. My sister is a thief. She works in this building and she stole my vehicle last night. If you do not drag her down here right now, I will have this entire firm sued for harboring a known criminal. Marcus, the head of Vanguard Security, stood impassively behind the desk. He was a former military police officer who usually handled corporate espionage and hostile termination escorts. He looked at Brittany as if she were a fascinating but particularly annoying insect. His massive arms were crossed loosely over his chest. He caught my eye as I hurried across the lobby. I gave him a fraction of a nod and I saw the corners of his mouth twitch as he fought to suppress a massive grin. He knew exactly who I was. The entire security staff knew exactly who I was. They were watching the two most arrogant women in Chicago scream at a billionaire inside her own lobby. Mom! Brittany! I gasped, rushing forward and grabbing my mother's arm. What are you doing here? Please keep your voices down. Patricia ripped her arm out of my grasp as if my touch was physically repulsive. Do not tell us to lower our voices, you ungrateful little brat. She snapped, her voice echoing harshly off the high ceilings. Several junior analysts crossing the lobby paused, holding their briefcases tight to watch the spectacle unfold. We know exactly what game you are playing, Lydia. You thought you could just walk out on your family and face zero consequences. You thought you could abandon your sister in her hour of need and hide in this pathetic little cubicle farm. I shrank back, perfectly playing the role of the cornered submissive daughter. Please stop yelling, I whispered frantically, glancing around at the gathered crowd of my own employees. My boss is going to hear you. You are going to get me fired. Brittany threw her head back and let out a sharp, vicious bark of laughter. Fired. She mocked, stepping directly into my personal space. Her perfume was suffocatingly sweet. Oh, honey, that is the absolute least of your problems today. Do you really think anyone in this building cares about a low-level administrative assistant? You are entirely replaceable, Lydia. You process paperwork for people who actually matter. People like me. She gestured expansively around the opulent lobby, her eyes scanning the sleek modern artwork and the expensive leather waiting chairs. It is actually hilarious that you work in a place like this, surrounded by real wealth and real power, while you sit in a tiny gray box sorting mail and answering phones. It must eat you alive knowing you will never belong in a world like this. You are just a parasite feeding off the success of actual visionaries. Marcus, the security chief, loudly cleared his throat, turning his face away to hide his absolute amusement. The junior analysts lingering near the turnstiles were literally biting the insides of their cheeks to keep from laughing out loud. They were watching a woman carrying a fake designer bag insult the majority shareholder of an elite private equity firm. I let my lower lip tremble, forcing tears to prick the corners of my eyes. Why did you tell security I stole your car? I asked, keeping my voice pitched high with manufactured panic. You know I drove away in my own sedan last night. I did not touch your things, because I wanted their attention. Brittany sneered, leaning in close, so only I could hear the pure, unadulterated malice in her voice. And I wanted you to know that I can destroy your little life with a single phone call. I can tell these rent-a-cops whatever I want, and they will believe me because I look like I belong here and you look like the help. You are nothing, Lydia. You have always been nothing. Patricia shoved her way past Brittany, her face tight with triumphant fury. She reached into her oversized leather tote bag and pulled out a thick manila envelope. She did not hand it to me gently. She drove the stiff edge of the envelope directly into the center of my chest, forcing me to stumble backward to catch it before it hit the floor. Consider yourself officially served, Patricia announced, her voice booming with theatrical authority. Your father was not making empty threats last night, Lydia. He spent the entire morning with Mr. Caldwell. We are taking you to court. I looked down at the envelope, my hands shaking perfectly on cue. What is this? It is a formal legal summons, Patricia stated, crossing her arms over her chest and looking down her nose at me. Your father is suing you for breach of fiduciary duty to the family trust. He is filing an emergency injunction to seize that mountain cabin. You have exactly 24 hours to surrender the deed, or Caldwell will absolutely crush you in court. He charges $1,000 an hour, Lydia. Do you even make that in a week? He will tie you up in litigation until you cannot even afford to pay rent on your miserable little apartment. I clutched the envelope to my chest, looking at my mother with wide, terrified eyes. You cannot do this, I pleaded, injecting just the right amount of desperation into my voice. That cabin is everything I have. I saved for years to buy it. If you sue me, I will not be able to afford a lawyer to fight back. I will lose everything. That is exactly the point, darling. Patricia smiled, a cold reptilian curving of her lips. We are going to bankrupt you. We are going to take everything you have until you are begging us for scraps. We are going to make an example out of you so that you never forget your place in this family ever again. You brought this entirely on yourself when you decided to be selfish. If you had just signed the paper last night, we could have avoided all this unpleasantness. I looked down at the marble floor, letting my shoulders sag in utter defeat. I had given them exactly what they wanted. I had let them feel powerful. I had let them savor the illusion of total control. I was simply waiting for them to finish their tantrum and leave so I could return to my corner office and initiate their complete financial annihilation. I had the default notices sitting on my desk ready to be mailed. I was going to take their mansion, their cars, and their entire business. But Brittany was not finished. Handing over a lawsuit was not enough to satisfy her deep-seated insecurities. She needed blood. She needed to watch me lose my livelihood right in front of her eyes to validate her own fragile ego. She wanted to stand in the lobby and watch security physically throw me out onto the street. Brittany turned away from me and marched directly up to Marcus at the security desk. She slammed her hand down on the polished black marble, her diamond rings clinking sharply against the stone. I am absolutely done dealing with this insubordinate little brat. Brittany demanded, her voice ringing across the silent lobby, commanding the attention of every single person in the room. I want to speak to this girl's manager immediately. She is stealing company time for personal matters, and she is harassing visitors in your lobby. I want her terminated right now. The sharp echo of Brittany's demand had barely settled over the polished marble when the soft, melodic chime of the primary executive elevator cut through the tension. The heavy frosted glass doors slid apart with a quiet hiss. David stepped out into the lobby. He looked immaculate, his custom-tailored charcoal suit draped perfectly over his broad shoulders, and his expression was a mask of cold corporate authority. He carried a leather folio tucked under one arm, exuding the precise kind of intimidating energy that sent junior analysts scurrying into stairwells to avoid his gaze. He paused, taking in the scene. He saw Marcus standing rigid behind the security desk. He saw my mother and sister practically vibrating with manufactured outrage. And then he saw me. I caught his eye for a fraction of a second. I gave him a single, nearly imperceptible nod and let my shoulders slump even further forward. David was a genius. He processed the entire dynamic in a microsecond. He did not miss a single beat. He strode across the lobby, his leather dress shoes clicking sharply against the stone floor. He bypassed my mother and sister entirely, stopping directly in front of me. He looked down at me with an expression of absolute profound disappointment. Lydia. He snapped, his voice sharp and carrying just enough volume to command the entire room. What exactly is going on down here? I have been waiting for those quarterly risk assessments for 20 minutes. Are you conducting personal business in the main lobby during company hours? I flinched, visibly shrinking away from him. I am so sorry, sir, I stammered, keeping my eyes glued to the floor. My family, they just showed up unannounced. I was just trying to get them to leave. Brittany practically lit up like a spotlight. Her eyes widened with absolute predatory glee as she realized she was speaking to my superior. She immediately stepped in front of me, blocking my path to the elevator. Excuse me, are you this girl's manager? Brittany asked, adopting a tone of cloying, artificial sweetness that she reserved exclusively for men with power. David turned his cold gaze toward her, looking her up and down, with practiced corporate detachment. I am a senior partner at this firm, he replied smoothly, perfectly playing the role of an arrogant executive who had no time for administrative staff drama. And I do not appreciate my employees treating our reception area like a public park. Who are you, and why are you disrupting my lobby? Patricia stepped forward, puffing out her chest. We are her family, and we are here because your employee is a thief and a liar. We had to serve her with formal legal papers because she stole a vehicle from our home last night. We tried to handle this quietly, but she refused to cooperate. We felt you should know exactly what kind of liability you have working for your company. David looked back at me, his brow furrowed in perfectly feigned disgust. Is this true, Lydia? Are you bringing criminal investigations into my firm? I shook my head frantically, gripping the edges of my cheap cardigan. No, sir, I swear. I drove my own car. They are just trying to intimidate me because of a family dispute. Please do not fire me. I need this job. I will go right back upstairs and finish the risk assessments. I beg you not to listen to a word she says. Brittany interrupted, her voice dripping with venom. She is a pathological liar. She has been freeloading off our father for years, and now she is trying to extort us. You really should reconsider her employment here. Someone with this much legal baggage is a massive risk to a prestigious firm like yours. I am sure you have hundreds of qualified applicants who do not steal from their own families. David let out a long, heavy sigh, pinching the bridge of his nose, as if dealing with me was the most exhausting part of his day. He reached out and smoothly plucked the thick manila envelope from my trembling hands. He glanced at the legal seal and then looked directly at my mother. "I apologize for this disruption, ladies," David said, his tone dripping with professional condescension. "Vanguard Acquisitions prides itself on discretion and absolute integrity. We have zero tolerance for employees who bring their personal legal disasters into our workspace. It is highly unprofessional and it reflects poorly on our corporate culture." He looked at me, his eyes narrowing. "Return to your desk immediately, Lydia. Gather your personal items and remain in your cubicle until Human Resources contacts you. We will be conducting a full disciplinary review of this incident before the end of the day. I will not have this firm dragged into your pathetic domestic squabbles." I let out a soft, pathetic gasp, covering my mouth with one hand. "Please, sir," I begged, tears freely rolling down my cheeks now. "Please do not do this. I cannot lose this job. My landlord just raised my rent. I have nowhere else to go." David turned his back to me, completely dismissing my existence. He focused entirely on Patricia and Brittany, offering them a tight, polite smile. "I assure you this matter will be handled internally with the utmost severity. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. Our security team will escort you to your vehicle. Have a pleasant afternoon." Brittany looked like she had just won the lottery. Her face was flushed with the absolute thrill of destroying me. She turned to me, a vicious, triumphant smirk twisting her features. She leaned in close, her voice a venomous whisper. "I told you I would ruin you," she hissed. "You are going to be homeless by the end of the month. Enjoy your pathetic cubicle while it lasts, Lydia. Maybe you can find a job flipping burgers where they do not care about a criminal record." Patricia adjusted the strap of her tote bag, looking at me with pure icy contempt. "You have 24 hours to sign over that cabin," she stated, her voice ringing clearly across the quiet lobby. "If we do not have the deed by tomorrow morning, Caldwell will file the injunction, and we will garnish whatever pathetic severance check this firm throws at you on your way out the door. Think very carefully about your next move. You have absolutely nothing left to leverage." With that final crushing ultimatum, my mother turned on her heel and marched toward the heavy glass exit doors. Brittany followed closely behind her, tossing her perfect blonde hair over her shoulder, her hips swaying with arrogant victory. They strutted out of Vanguard Acquisitions like conquering royalty, completely blinded by their own narcissism. They firmly believed they had just humiliated me, ruined my career, and forced me into total submission. I stood frozen in the center of the lobby, staring at the floor, while Marcus and the security team watched them exit. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind them, sealing out the noise of the busy Chicago street. The silence in the lobby was absolute. I counted to 3 in my head. Then I slowly dropped my hands from my face. I rolled my shoulders back, instantly shedding the trembling, frightened persona. I stood up perfectly straight, realigning my spine until I was standing at my full height. I wiped the manufactured tears from my cheeks with the back of my hand. David turned to face me. The stern, angry boss routine dissolved instantly, replaced by a sharp, predatory grin. He held out the manila envelope, offering it back to me. "Well," David said, his voice returning to its normal, rich cadence, "I think you might be up for an Academy Award, Lydia. That was an absolutely spectacular performance. I almost felt bad for you for a second." I took the envelope from his hand, a cold, dangerous smile spreading across my own face. "You played the arrogant middle manager beautifully, David," I replied, brushing a speck of dust off his expensive lapel. "They bought every single second of it. They actually believe I am sitting in a cubicle waiting for Human Resources to fire me." Marcus let out a loud, booming laugh from behind the security desk. "Ma'am, I have got to tell you," Marcus chuckled, shaking his head in disbelief. "It took every ounce of self-control I possess not to burst out laughing when she told you to go back to your cubicle. I was biting my tongue so hard I think I tasted blood. They really have absolutely no idea who you are, do they?" "Not a clue, Marcus," I said, turning to look at the towering frosted glass walls of my empire. "They think I am completely powerless. They think I am drowning." David walked beside me as we headed back toward the private executive elevator. "So what is the play?" he asked, pressing the call button. "They think they just backed you into a corner. They think that lawsuit is a lethal weapon. The elevator doors slid open and we stepped inside. As the glass cab began its rapid ascent back to the top floor, I looked down at the thick legal envelope in my hands. I did not even bother opening it. It was completely irrelevant. It was a threat based on a reality that no longer existed. They were trying to sue me to protect assets that I now legally owned. They were trying to bankrupt a woman who could buy and sell their entire bloodline before lunch. The play is total annihilation. I answered, my voice dropping to a calm, deadly register. They just proved exactly how far they are willing to go to destroy me. They tried to get me fired. They tried to leave me completely destitute. They have absolutely no mercy and no loyalty, which means I no longer owe them any restraint. The elevator chimed, arriving at the top floor. The brushed steel doors opened, revealing the hushed, aggressive hum of the executive suite. I walked straight past the primary conference room and headed directly for my corner office. David followed close behind me, his eyes bright with anticipation. I walked behind my massive glass desk and tossed the unopened lawsuit directly into the trash can. I did not need to read it. I did not care what lies my father had spun to his expensive lawyer. I sat down in my leather executive chair and woke up my dual monitors. I had drafted the formal notice of default earlier, placing a hard copy in a crimson envelope for the courier. But Apex Holdings operated in the digital age. The physical copy was merely a formality, a tangible piece of terror for Richard to hold in his hands. The actual execution of the corporate guillotine happened online. I pulled up the secure portal for Apex Holdings. I accessed the newly acquired debt portfolio, identifying the master loans, the commercial logistics fleet, the Oak Brook estate, and the fraudulent shell companies Brittany had created. Everything was neatly organized, displaying the massive overdue balances that Obsidian Capital had failed to collect. I opened the primary communication terminal directly linked to the Federal Banking Registry and the corporate restructuring courts. I attached the digital notices of immediate default, outlining the refusal of any grace period and demanding total asset seizure within 48 hours. David stood beside my desk, his arms crossed, watching the screens with absolute focus. He knew exactly what this meant. There was no going back once this command was executed. The financial shockwave would hit my father's corporate accounts within seconds. His credit lines would freeze. His operating capital would instantly evaporate. I looked at the cursor hovering over the final execution command. I thought about the sheer, unadulterated malice in Brittany's eyes as she tried to strip away my livelihood. I thought about my mother shoving that envelope into my chest, reveling in my perceived suffering. They wanted a war. They wanted a massacre. I reached out and placed my hand on the mouse. I hit send. The screens flashed green, acknowledging the transmission. The execution orders were digitally sealed, encrypted, and launched into the global financial network. The trap had officially snapped shut. The dominoes were falling, and there was absolutely nothing Richard, Patricia, or Brittany could do to stop the inevitable collapse. I leaned back in my chair, interlacing my fingers, and looking out over the sprawling city of Chicago. The clock had officially started ticking down to their total absolute ruin, and I was going to enjoy every single second of the fallout. I owned them now, body and soul. The ghost of the scared little girl they had bullied for 33 years was dead and buried. I was Vanguard, and I was coming to collect. 2 weeks passed. 14 days of complete radio silence from my father regarding the impending financial apocalypse. I had anticipated immediate panic. I had expected a barrage of frantic legal maneuvers, desperate phone calls to the shadow directors of Apex Holdings, or at the very least a sudden halt to their reckless spending. Instead, Richard did what he always did when reality threatened to breach his carefully constructed walls of arrogance. He completely ignored it. David had tracked the internal communications of my father's logistics firm through our secured back channels. Richard had taken one look at the formal notice of default from Apex Holdings, laughed out loud in his executive suite, and instructed his legal team to treat it as a clerical banking error. Because he had never heard of Apex Holdings, he genuinely believed they were simply some bottom-tier collection agency making a bureaucratic mistake. He assumed his original predatory deal with Obsidian Capital was still secure. He thought he still had time. He thought he was untouchable. To double down on his delusion and project an image of absolute prosperity to his increasingly nervous private investors, Richard decided to throw a party. It was not just a party. It was a wildly extravagant, obscenely expensive engagement gala for Brittany and her wealthy fiancé. It was a classic smoke and mirrors tactic designed to blind his creditors with the sheer glare of his spending. If a man was bankrupt, he would not be renting out the entire grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel. He would not be importing thousands of rare white orchids from Holland. He would not be serving vintage Dom Perignon to 300 of Chicago's social elite. He was spending money he did not have to prove a point he could not sustain. I walked into the grand ballroom of the Drake feeling like a ghost haunting a graveyard of my own making. The sheer scale of the financial waste was breathtaking. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over tables draped in heavy imported silk. A 12-piece jazz orchestra played flawlessly on a raised stage surrounded by towering ice sculptures that were slowly melting onto silver trays. Waiters in pristine white tuxedos glided through the crowd carrying trays of beluga caviar and gold leaf truffles. I moved through the sea of designer gowns and bespoke tuxedos, keeping strictly to the periphery. I was not there to celebrate. I was there to conduct a final physical audit of my newly acquired assets. I sipped a glass of sparkling water and watched the room with clinical detachment. I recognized several of my father's key investors standing near the center of the room, laughing loudly and smoking expensive cigars. They looked relaxed, completely taken in by the lavish display of wealth. They had no idea that the man buying their top-shelf drinks was currently existing on borrowed time and stolen money. I wore a simple, understated black sheath dress. It was not haute couture. It did not feature a plunging neckline or a train of hand-stitched beads. It was practical, professional, and entirely invisible in a room designed for peacocks. That was exactly how I wanted it. I maintained my cover as the pathetic, submissive daughter who had been dragged to the event purely to serve as a contrasting backdrop to Brittany's radiant perfection. My mother caught my eye from across the room and offered a smirk of pure condescension before turning back to her wealthy friends. She thought the lawsuit she had shoved into my chest 2 weeks ago had terrified me into compliance. She thought my silence was surrender. I made my way to one of the mahogany bars set up near the terrace doors, intending to order a club soda with lime. As I stood waiting for the bartender, a heavy, suffocating presence materialized beside me. Well, if it is not the family disappointment. I turned my head slowly. Standing next to me swirling a glass of amber liquid was Preston, Brittany's fiancé. Preston was the heir to a regional shipping conglomerate, a man who had never worked a difficult day in his 30 years of existence. He wore a custom velvet dinner jacket and a smile that suggested he found the entire world highly amusing and entirely beneath him. He was the male equivalent of my sister, perfectly groomed, deeply arrogant, and completely hollow inside. "Hello, Preston," I said, my voice flat and impeccably polite. "Congratulations on the engagement." He did not say thank you. He simply looked me up and down, his eyes lingering on my unadorned black dress with blatant distaste. "Brittany told me about your little scene in the lobby of your office building," he said, taking a slow sip of drink and leaning against the polished brass rail of the bar. "She told me you actually cried when her mother served you with those legal papers. It must be exhausting living in a constant state of panic. But I suppose that is what happens when you lack ambition. You end up working a dead-end desk job and fighting your own family for scraps." I looked at him, absorbing the insult with a terrifying, serene calmness. I did not break eye contact. I did not flinch. "Brittany is a visionary." Preston continued, leaning closer, invading my personal space to assert his dominance. "She is building a lifestyle brand. She understands how to leverage capital. She understands real wealth. And you." He chuckled, a low, mean sound in the back of his throat. "You process paperwork. You wear cheap dresses to a gala that costs more than you will make in a decade. You are a clerk, Lydia. You should really consider handing over that cabin quietly. Caldwell will destroy you in court, and it is just embarrassing for Brittany to have a sister who cannot even afford a decent lawyer." I stared at the expensive crystal glass in his hand. I stared at the vintage champagne bubbling inside it. I looked at the imported floral arrangements cascading down the walls and the 12-piece band playing on the stage. Preston thought he was insulting a broke administrative assistant. He was completely unaware that I literally owned the glass he was holding. I owned the champagne he was drinking. I owned the massive logistics fleet that his future father-in-law was using to secure the shadow loans funding this fraudulent party. My shell company was the only reason the lights were still on in this ballroom. He was mocking a billionaire while standing on a trap door that I controlled with a single keystroke. You are absolutely right, Preston. I said, my voice soft and perfectly level. I am just a clerk. I handle the paperwork. I process the numbers. I make sure everything adds up perfectly at the end of the day. He smirked, taking another arrogant sip. Exactly. Know your place, Lydia. It makes life so much easier for everyone. I offered him a cold, empty smile. You have no idea how much I appreciate numbers, Preston. Because the numbers never lie. People lie. People pretend they have money they do not have. People throw massive parties to hide the fact that they are drowning in toxic debt. But the numbers always tell the absolute truth, and eventually the bill always comes due. Preston frowned, his smug expression faltering for a fraction of a second. He did not understand what I was saying, but he recognized the dangerous sharp edge in my voice. He opened his mouth to reply, to assert his unearned dominance once again, but the sudden sharp squeal of audio feedback pierced the air. The 12-piece jazz band abruptly stopped playing. The smooth melody of the saxophone was cut short, leaving a ringing silence in the massive ballroom. The low roar of 300 conversations slowly died away as the wealthy guests turned their attention toward the raised stage. Brittany stood dead center in the spotlight. She looked like a plastic bride atop a wedding cake, dressed in a shimmering silver gown that clung tightly to her figure. The massive diamond engagement ring on her finger caught the harsh glare of the stage lights flashing brilliantly across the darkened room. She held a microphone in one hand and a freshly poured glass of champagne in the other. She tapped the microphone twice. The sharp thud echoed loudly, confirming she had the undivided attention of every single investor, socialite, and family member in the room. Thank you all so much for coming tonight, Brittany announced, her voice amplified and dripping with manufactured sweetness. Preston and I are so incredibly blessed to be surrounded by so much love, so much support, and so much success. We are looking forward to building a brilliant future together, honoring the incredible legacy my father has created. The crowd murmured in polite approval. Richard stood near the front of the stage, puffing his chest out and beaming with absolute pride. Patricia clapped her hands together, her face shining with triumph. It was the perfect picture of an untouchable dynasty. But as Brittany continued speaking, her gaze swept over the crowd. She bypassed her wealthy friends. She ignored the powerful investors. Her eyes locked directly onto me, standing alone by the mahogany bar in the shadows at the edge of the room. Her perfect smile hardened. The artificial sweetness vanished instantly, replaced by a sharp, vicious malice that sent a ripple of tension through the air. And speaking of family, Brittany said, her voice cutting through the heavy silence like a razor blade, I want to make a special toast tonight. A toast to the people who are not going to be part of our future. To the people who try to drag us down because they are consumed by their own pathetic failures. She raised her glass high in the air, staring right through me, her intentions entirely clear. The trap had not just been the lawsuit or the ambush in my lobby. The trap was this exact moment. The trap was this exact moment. Brittany gripped the microphone tighter, her knuckles turning white as she leaned into the heavy silver stand. The entire grand ballroom hung on her every word. She was an absolute master of emotional manipulation, playing the role of the innocent victim and the triumphant victor simultaneously. She loved the spotlight more than she loved the man standing beside her. She fed on the attention of the room, drawing energy from the hundreds of eyes fixed upon her shimmering silver gown. Preston and I have been searching for the perfect location to celebrate our union, Brittany announced, her voice echoing sharply off the gilded ceiling and the massive crystal chandeliers. We wanted a place that truly represents us as a couple. Something intimate but breathtaking. Something that speaks to our family heritage and the enduring power of legacy. She paused, letting the dramatic silence stretch across the opulent space. She looked directly at me. Her eyes were hard and flat, completely devoid of the sugary warmth she was projecting to her audience. She was aiming right for my chest. I am thrilled to announce that we have finally selected our wedding venue, Brittany declared, her voice rising in a crescendo of manufactured joy. It is a charming rustic mountain cabin, a beautiful secluded piece of property that my incredibly generous parents are currently reclaiming from my ungrateful sister. The words hung in the air, heavy and toxic. For a fraction of a second there was a palpable dip in the ambient energy of the room. It was an incredibly crass thing to say at a high society engagement gala. You do not air dirty family laundry while serving vintage Dom Perignon to your private investors. It broke the unspoken rules of their elite social circle. But the guests were too polite, too deeply entrenched in the social contract of the wealthy to express any outward shock. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their custom-tailored suits and designer gowns, exchanging rapid, wide-eyed glances. Then almost mechanically the applause began. It started near the front of the stage led enthusiastically by Preston's insufferable groomsmen, and it rolled through the crowd like a slow, hesitant wave. My mother stood perfectly still near the towering ice sculptures. Patricia did not clap, she did not need to. Her entire posture was a monument to vindictive triumph. She caught my gaze from across the massive room and shot me a look of pure, unadulterated smugness. She raised her chin, her eyes glittering with the absolute thrill of my public execution. She firmly believed she had just witnessed the total destruction of my spirit. Beside her, my father was equally reveling in the moment. Richard caught my eye, lifted his crystal flute of champagne, and offered me a slow, mocking salute. He tilted his glass in my direction, a silent, arrogant confirmation that he believed he had won the war. He believed the lawsuit had broken me. He believed the cabin was already his. He thought he was the undisputed apex predator in the room. They waited for it. I could feel the collective weight of their expectation pressing down on my shoulders like a physical force. Brittany stood on the stage, literally holding her breath, waiting for my face to crumble. Patricia leaned forward slightly, desperate to see the tears spill over my eyelashes. Richard wore a complacent smirk, waiting for me to drop my gaze in shame, turn on my heel, and run out of the ballroom in a fit of hysterical humiliation. That was the script they had written for me. That was the role I had played for 33 years. I was supposed to be the weak, overly emotional, easily defeated scapegoat who always broke under pressure. I was supposed to shatter. I did not run. I did not drop my gaze. I did not cry. Instead, I let a slow, perfectly calm smile spread across my face. I raised my own glass of sparkling water, holding it up high enough for the harsh stage lights to catch the crystal. I looked directly into Brittany's eyes and I applauded. I brought my hands together in slow, measured claps, joining the polite applause of the crowd. I nodded at her, my smile never wavering, projecting an aura of absolute terrifying serenity. The effect on my family was instantaneous and deeply satisfying. Brittany's triumphant smirk faltered. Her grip on the microphone loosened, and a flicker of genuine panicked confusion darted across her perfectly contoured face. She had fired her absolute best shot, a public humiliation designed to shatter my psyche in front of 300 people, and I had simply absorbed it and smiled back. It completely broke her brain. She looked toward our mother for reassurance, her confidence suddenly evaporating. Patricia was no longer smiling. The smug satisfaction had vanished from her features, replaced by a tight, rigid mask of concern. She knew me. She knew the daughter she had emotionally battered for decades. The daughter she knew would have been sobbing uncontrollably by now, fleeing toward the exit. My absolute lack of an emotional response unnerved her on a primal level. She took a step toward Richard, whispering something urgently into his ear. Richard frowned, his mock salute dropping as he finally noticed my unblinking, serene expression. The predator suddenly realized the prey was not running, and it terrified him. I took a slow sip of my drink, savoring the crisp bite of the lime. Let them wonder. Let them feel that cold, creeping sensation of dread pooling in their stomachs. They thought they were playing chess, moving me around the board like a disposable pawn. They did not realize the board had already been flipped, the pieces had been scattered, and the building they were playing in was currently scheduled for total demolition. This lavish engagement party was a financial funeral, and they were the only ones who did not know they were already dead. The band leader, sensing the awkward, heavy tension lingering after Britney's highly inappropriate toast immediately counted off a fast-paced jazz number. The music swelled loudly, filling the grand ballroom with energetic brass and heavy percussion. The crowd eagerly turned their attention away from the stage, grateful for the sudden distraction. They dove back into their superficial conversations and expensive drinks, desperate to pretend the awkward moment had never happened. The spotlight shifted away from the stage. The tension broke. I placed my half-empty glass on the polished mahogany bar. I smoothed the front of my simple black dress. My performance in the ballroom was officially concluded. I had given them exactly what they needed, a false sense of security deeply undermined by a flash of inexplicable, terrifying confidence. I had planted the seed of doubt in their minds. Now it was time to execute the final phase of the operation. I turned away from the bar and slipped seamlessly into the shifting crowd. I moved with purposeful invisibility, weaving through the clusters of laughing socialites and dodging the white-coated waitstaff carrying trays of hors d'oeuvres. I kept my head down, avoiding eye contact with any lingering family friends who might try to engage me in pitying conversation. I reached the heavy brass doors leading out to the main corridor and pushed through them, leaving the chaotic noise of the jazz band and the clinking glasses behind me. The hallway outside the grand ballroom was quiet, lined with thick crimson carpets and antique gold-framed mirrors. I walked swiftly down the corridor, my heels making no sound on the plush runner. I was not heading for the main exit or the coat check. I was heading deeper into the hotel's private event spaces. Richard was a deeply arrogant man, but he was also a creature of habit. Whenever he hosted a major event at a luxury hotel, he always commanded a private executive suite on the same floor to act as his operational staging ground. He needed a secure place to store his briefcase, his private ledgers, and the physical contracts he used to impress his wealthy investors behind closed doors, away from the noise of the party. I turned the corner and found exactly what I was looking for. The Palmer Suite, a heavy solid oak door with a discreet brass plaque. I paused, glancing up and down the long empty corridor to ensure I was completely alone. The ambient noise of the engagement party was just a distant muted thrum through the thick hotel walls. I stepped up to the oak door and grasped the heavy brass handle. It was locked exactly as I expected it to be. Richard never left his private documents unsecured. But Richard also severely underestimated the people he considered beneath him. He underestimated his administrative staff. He underestimated his security detail. And he had vastly underestimated his eldest daughter. I reached into my small black clutch purse and pulled out a sleek white electronic master keycard. I had quietly secured it from the hotel's senior event coordinator 20 minutes earlier, paying a very handsome unquestioned bribe using a corporate Apex Holdings expense account. Money moved mountains when applied correctly. I swiped the keycard against the black electronic lock reader. A small light flashed a brilliant solid green. I heard the heavy internal deadbolt click open with a satisfying mechanical thud. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped silently into Richard's private sanctuary. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, instantly silencing the thumping bass of the jazz band downstairs. The Palmer Suite was a sprawling monument to my father's suffocating ego. The air was thick with the scent of stale cigar smoke, expensive leather, and spilled scotch. A massive crystal chandelier hung low over a polished conference table, but the room was currently illuminated only by the soft amber glow of a few brass desk lamps. Richard felt untouchable in spaces like this. He believed a locked door and a five-star hotel rating shielded him from the consequences of his own reckless greed. I walked swiftly across the plush oriental rug toward the massive mahogany desk dominating the far end of the suite. Richard was a deeply sloppy man, disguised by expensive tailoring. He relied entirely on intimidation and the illusion of power to protect his secrets. His laptop sat open on the desk, the screen dark, but the power light pulsing steadily. He had not bothered to power it down before heading down to the ballroom to bask in the adoration of his sycophants. I tapped the spacebar. The screen flared to life, demanding a password. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I knew my father. He lacked imagination, and he was deeply crippled by his own narcissism. I typed in Brittany's birth date. Incorrect. I typed in his own birth date. Incorrect. I took a slow breath and typed in the exact date he had founded his logistics company, the day he believed he became a god among men. The screen unlocked instantly. Arrogance always bred complacency. I reached into my clutch and retrieved a sleek black encrypted flash drive. I inserted it into the side port of the laptop. My movements were fluid and precise. I did not have time to browse through his vacation photos or his country club correspondence. I opened his primary email client and bypassed the standard inbox, diving straight into his archived local folders. I navigated to a hidden directory buried under layers of mundane tax documents. I was looking for the connective tissue between his failing logistics fleet and the sudden, inexplicable influx of cash he was currently burning through downstairs in the grand ballroom. I found a folder simply labeled Fleet Restructuring. It was a laughably benign title for what I knew had to be a financial massacre. I opened the most recent thread and began to read. My blood ran cold, but my pulse remained perfectly steady. It was not restructuring, it was wholesale looting. The emails outlined a comprehensive, systematic draining of the logistics company employee pension fund. My father had not just borrowed against the retirement savings of his warehouse workers and truck drivers. He had completely liquidated the accounts. He was using the life savings of hundreds of working-class families to fund Brittany's imported orchids and the vintage champagne currently flowing freely downstairs. It was a level of sociopathic greed that went beyond simple financial mismanagement. It was pure evil. But the real treasure, the ultimate weapon, was the sender of the most damning emails in the thread. It was not Richard giving the orders. It was Attorney Caldwell. Caldwell had not just advised Richard on the legal loopholes of the maneuver. The emails proved that Caldwell had actively drafted the fraudulent documents. Caldwell had set up the untraceable shell accounts in the Cayman Islands. Caldwell had orchestrated the entire embezzlement scheme, providing step-by-step instructions on how to bypass federal audits and hide the missing funds from the Internal Revenue Service. He had crossed the line from legal counsel to active co-conspirator in a massive multi-million-dollar federal fraud case. Caldwell was looking at a decade in federal prison and disbarment. I highlighted the entire folder and dragged it onto my flash drive. A small progress bar appeared on the screen, calculating the transfer of hundreds of highly incriminating documents. While the digital files copied, I turned my attention to the physical space. Richard loved the tangible weight of his power. He did not trust everything to the cloud. Sitting right next to an empty crystal tumbler were two thick leather-bound ledgers. I opened the top ledger and pulled out my phone. I began snapping high-resolution photographs of every single page. The handwritten numbers detailed the horrific truth. I photographed the offshore account numbers, the routing codes, the fake vendor invoices used to wash the stolen pension money. I captured every single piece of physical evidence that tied Richard and Caldwell directly to the theft. My camera shutter clicked softly, a rhythmic sound that sealed their fate with every flash. The progress bar on the laptop screen hit 100%. The transfer was complete. I closed the email client, purged the recent activity log, and ejected the flash drive with a soft click. I dropped it into the hidden pocket of my clutch alongside my phone. I had the final nail for Caldwell's coffin. I had the absolute leverage required to destroy my father's primary attack dog. I reached out to push the laptop screen down. Just as my fingers touched the metal casing, the heavy brass handle of the suite door clicked loudly. I froze, my hands hovering over the desk. The heavy oak door swung open with a slow creak. It was not Richard. Standing in the doorway, illuminated by the dim hallway light, was Attorney Caldwell himself. He wore a sharp black tuxedo that looked slightly too tight across his chest. He held a half-empty glass of scotch in one hand. His face was flushed and his eyes were slightly glazed from the expensive liquor flowing downstairs. But his gaze snapped into terrifyingly sharp focus. The second he saw me standing behind Richard's desk, Caldwell smiled. It was a greasy, condescending expression that made my skin crawl. He stepped fully into the room and let the heavy oak door swing shut behind him. The internal deadbolt engaged with a loud, decisive thud. We were locked inside the suite together. Well, 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 Caldwell drawled, taking a slow sip of his scotch. He leaned back against the locked door, blocking my only exit. Look what the cat dragged in. Or rather, look what the rat is trying to drag out. I stood perfectly still, keeping my hands resting lightly on the edge of the mahogany desk. I did not speak. I let him fill the silence with his own arrogance. Snooping won't save you, Lydia. Caldwell sneered, taking a few slow, deliberate steps into the room. His shoes sank into the plush oriental rug. He looked at the closed laptop and then back up at my face, his eyes gleaming with malicious delight. Did you really think you could sneak up here and find some magical piece of paper that would save your pathetic little cabin? Did you think Richard leaves his vulnerabilities lying around for a low-level secretary to find? You are completely out of your depth, little girl. I watched him approach, analyzing his posture, his slurred speech, and his absolute certainty that he held all the power in the room. He thought I was a desperate, terrified woman clinging to a tiny piece of real estate. He thought I was looking for a lifeline. He had absolutely no idea that I was holding the detonator to his entire professional and personal existence. You should be downstairs, Caldwell. I said, my voice smooth and devoid of any emotion. You are missing a very expensive party. I prefer the quiet, he replied, setting his scotch glass down heavily on a side table. And I prefer handling business directly. He reached inside his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a thick folded document. He tapped it against his palm, the heavy legal paper making a sharp slapping sound. He walked right up to the desk, stopping just a few feet away from me. He slammed the document down on the polished wood. It was the deed transfer for the mountain cabin. It was fully drafted, requiring only my signature at the bottom to hand ownership directly over to Richard. Your mother told me you were refusing to cooperate, Caldwell said, leaning over the desk, his breath smelling sharply of alcohol and expensive cigars. She told me you actually had the nerve to stand in the ballroom and applaud while Brittany humiliated you. I have to admit, it is a fascinating psychological defense mechanism, total denial. But reality is catching up to you right now, Lydia. I looked down at the deed transfer and then slowly raised my eyes to meet his. I am not signing that, I stated simply. Caldwell let out a harsh, barking laugh. You really do not understand the situation, do you? He shook his head, leaning even closer, his eyes turning cold and predatory. You are standing inside a locked private suite owned by my client. You have bypassed hotel security. You have been caught red-handed snooping through sensitive corporate property. That is called trespassing, Lydia. That is called corporate espionage. He tapped a thick manicured finger directly on the signature line of the document. Here is what is going to happen. Caldwell whispered, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly register. You are going to pick up a pen, and you are going to sign this deed right now. You are going to sign away that cabin and walk out of this hotel with absolutely nothing. If you hesitate for even 1 second, I am picking up this phone. I will call the police. I will have hotel security drag you out of this building in handcuffs in front of 300 of Chicago's most elite citizens. I will ruin whatever pathetic career you have left, and I will make sure you spend the next 5 years fighting criminal trespassing charges. Sign the paper, Lydia. Right now. I looked down at the heavy parchment paper of the deed transfer resting on the mahogany desk. My name was typed neatly at the bottom next to a blank line waiting for my signature. I did not reach for the pen. Instead, I looked back up at Caldwell. His face was flushed with cheap victory and expensive scotch. He stood blocking the only exit, holding his phone like a loaded weapon. You know, Caldwell, I said, my voice dropping to a conversational murmur. I have always admired your legal strategy. You have a reputation in this city. People say you are the man who can make any financial inconvenience disappear. You structured my father's initial public offering. You handled the acquisition of his entire logistics fleet. You are not just his attorney. You are the architect of his entire empire. Caldwell puffed out his chest slightly. His ego was a massive, fragile balloon, and I was holding the needle. He lowered his phone a fraction of an inch, a smug smile stretching across his face. It is good to see you finally showing some respect, Lydia, he said, taking another slow sip of his drink. Your father is a powerful man, but he requires guidance. He needs a steady hand at the wheel to navigate the complexities of corporate law. I protect his interests. That is why I am telling you to sign the paper. I am protecting you from making a catastrophic mistake. I smiled, folding my hands together and resting them on the desk. You are certainly thorough, I replied. But I do wonder about your risk assessment. For instance, when you advise a client on asset restructuring, do you ever worry about the federal implications? Caldwell frowned. His smile slipped just a fraction. What are you talking about? I tilted my head, studying him with clinical precision. I am talking about the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, specifically the statutes regarding fiduciary duties and the misappropriation of pension funds. It is a fascinating area of corporate law, do you not agree? And then there is the Securities and Exchange Commission Rule 10b-5 regarding the employment of manipulative and deceptive devices to defraud investors. The color completely drained from Caldwell's face. The flush of alcohol vanished, replaced by a sickly pale gray. His grip on his scotch glass tightened so hard his knuckles turned white. He stopped leaning against the door and stood up perfectly straight. I took a step toward him. I kept my voice incredibly soft, forcing him to strain to hear me. If a hypothetical attorney were to draft documents routing an entire employee pension fund into an offshore Cayman account, I continued, my eyes locking onto his. And if that hypothetical attorney were to create fake vendor invoices to wash that stolen money to fund his client's lavish personal lifestyle, well, that would not just be a civil dispute. That would be federal fraud. That would carry a mandatory minimum sentence. That hypothetical attorney would lose his license, his firm, and his freedom. Caldwell opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His chest was rising and falling rapidly. The absolute certainty he had possessed just 3 minutes ago was completely gone. He was staring at me as if I had just transformed into a monster right in front of his eyes. He glanced nervously toward the desk where his laptop sat closed. He looked back at me, his mind frantically racing, trying to figure out exactly what I had seen and what I could prove. You are bluffing, he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. You are a secretary. You do not know anything about corporate finance. I did not argue with him. I did not need to prove anything to a dead man. I picked up my small black clutch from the edge of the desk. I walked directly toward him. He was a large man, but as I approached, he instinctively took a step back, his self-preservation overriding his arrogance. He moved away from the door. I reached out and grasped the heavy brass handle. I turned it and pulled the oak door open, letting the muffled sound of the jazz band flood back into the quiet suite. I paused in the doorway and looked over my shoulder at the terrified attorney. See you in court, Mr. Caldwell, I said, my tone perfectly pleasant. Make sure your malpractice insurance is paid up. I stepped out into the hallway and let the door click shut behind me, leaving him alone with his scotch and his impending doom. I walked down the plush corridor of the Drake Hotel, feeling entirely untethered from the opulent reality around me. I passed through the lobby, ignoring the lingering socialites and the obsequious hotel staff. The crisp, cold Chicago air hit my face the moment I pushed through the revolving glass doors. It felt clean and sharp. I hailed a cab, standing on the curb while the sounds of the city washed over me. The ride back to my apartment was a blur of neon lights and wet pavement. I sat in the back seat, resting my head against the cold window. I had the flash drive securely tucked into my purse. I had the photographs of the physical ledgers stored in a secure cloud server. I had everything I needed to destroy Caldwell and send my father to a federal penitentiary. But the criminal charges were secondary. The financial execution was my primary objective. I paid the driver and walked up the 3 flights of stairs to my modest apartment. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The space was small, quiet, and sparsely decorated. It was a stark contrast to the grand ballroom I had just left, but it was mine. I walked over to the kitchen counter and dropped my keys into a small ceramic bowl. I opened my laptop and woke the screen. It was 11:45 in the evening. I logged into the Apex Holdings Secure Executive Portal. The dashboard loaded, displaying the active status of Richard Wilson's commercial debt portfolio. The massive red numbers blinked steadily, indicating the total amount in default. I had issued the formal notice of default exactly 14 days ago. Under the strict terms of the predatory loan agreement Richard had signed with Obsidian Capital before I acquired it, he was granted exactly a 14-day grace period to cure the default. If he failed to produce the entire outstanding balance by midnight on the 14th day, the foreclosure protocol would automatically activate. There would be no extensions. There would be no negotiations. The system was designed to be absolute and merciless. I sat on a simple wooden stool at my kitchen island and watched the digital clock on the corner of my screen. It was 11:50. Richard was likely still at the Drake Hotel, basking in the afterglow of his expensive charade. He was probably shaking hands with his investors, telling them about his brilliant plans for the upcoming fiscal quarter. He had completely ignored the default notice, treating it as a clerical error. He had chosen to throw a party instead of auditing his own accounts. 11:55. I poured myself a glass of cold water and took a slow sip. My heart was beating with a steady rhythmic thud. I felt no guilt. I felt no hesitation. They had engineered their own destruction through sheer arrogance and unbridled greed. I was simply the mechanism delivering the consequences they had evaded for decades. 11:58. I pulled up the secondary monitoring screen. It was linked directly to the commercial banking networks that held my father's operational accounts. I wanted to watch the exact moment his financial life support was severed. 11:59. The seconds ticked by, agonizingly slow. I thought about Brittany standing in the spotlight, trying to use my trauma as a punchline for her wealthy friends. I thought about my mother smiling at my pain. I thought about my father mocking my career while secretly stealing from his own employees to fund his facade. The clock struck 12. The screen refreshed instantly. The status indicator on the Apex Holdings dashboard shifted from yellow to a solid glowing red. The word foreclosure flashed across the top of the portfolio file. The grace period had officially expired. The execution orders I had prepared were automatically released into the federal banking system. I watched the secondary monitoring screen as the automated commands hit Richard's commercial accounts. It happened in real time. The primary operating accounts for his logistics fleet were instantly frozen. The massive credit lines he used to maintain cash flow were permanently locked. The asset seizure protocols were initiated, tagging the commercial vehicles, the warehouse properties, and the Oak Brook estate for immediate repossession. His financial empire was officially dead. The foreclosure on their business and their mansion was now active and entirely irreversible. I closed the laptop. The glow of the screen vanished, plunging my small apartment into darkness. The deed was done. I stood up, walked to my bedroom, and went to sleep with the profound peacefulness of a woman who had just balanced the scales of the universe. I slept deeply and dreamlessly for the first time in weeks. The heavy weight of constant anticipation had been lifted from my chest. I was completely untethered, floating in a quiet, dark void where my family could no longer reach me. At 6 o'clock the next morning, the absolute silence of my apartment was shattered. A violent, furious pounding rattled my front door. The blows were heavy and erratic, shaking the doorframe and echoing loudly through the small hallway. It was not a polite knock. It was the desperate, aggressive hammering of someone who was completely losing their mind. I opened my eyes, staring at the ceiling. The pounding intensified, accompanied by a muffled, hoarse voice shouting from the other side of the deadbolt. "Lydia! Open this door right now! Lydia!" I slowly sat up and threw off the covers. I did not rush. I walked out of my bedroom and stood in the small living room, looking at the front door as it vibrated under another heavy strike. It was Richard. His voice was raw and stripped of all its usual polished arrogance. He sounded like a cornered animal. "Open the door, Lydia," he roared, his fist slamming against the wood. "I know you are in there. What did you do? What the hell did you do?" I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open just a few inches. Richard did not wait for an invitation. He shoved his shoulder against the painted wood, forcing his way into my small living room with the brute momentum of a desperate man. The heavy door slammed against the interior wall, shaking the picture frames I had hung just weeks before. I stumbled backward, playing the role of the startled, intimidated daughter. Richard stood in the center of my rug, gasping for air. The transformation was shocking. Less than 8 hours ago, he had been the undisputed king of the grand ballroom at the Drake Hotel, sipping vintage champagne and accepting the adulation of Chicago's elite. Now he looked like a man who had spent the night sleeping in an alley. His custom tuxedo jacket was gone. The crisp white dress shirt he wore was heavily wrinkled and soaked with sweat at the collar. His expensive silk bow tie hung loose and unraveled around his neck like a broken noose. His breathing was harsh and ragged, filling the quiet space of my apartment. His eyes were bloodshot, darting frantically around my modest living room, as if expecting to find a team of federal agents hiding behind the curtains. "What did you do?" he demanded, his voice a ragged, breathless hiss. He pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my face. "You spoke to Caldwell. You did something to the accounts. Everything is frozen, Lydia. Every single line of credit is locked. The logistics fleet, the operating capital, the payroll accounts. The bank is saying I am in total default. They are threatening immediate foreclosure on the Oakbrook house." I wrapped my arms around my waist, letting my hands tremble slightly. I looked away from him, focusing on the floorboards. "I do not know what you are talking about, Dad," I whispered, injecting a thick layer of manufactured panic into my voice. "I did not do anything to your accounts. How could I? I am just a secretary. You said so yourself." Richard stared at me, his chest heaving. His bloodshot eyes searched my face, looking for any sign of deception. He saw only the wide-eyed, fearful expression he had conditioned me to wear for 33 years. The rigid, aggressive posture he had stormed in with began to slowly deflate. The raw, blind panic in his eyes shifted as his narcissistic survival instincts took over. He realized that screaming at me was not going to solve his immediate crisis. He needed something from me. He needed the only tangible asset he thought he could quickly liquidate. He needed the mountain cabin. Richard reached up and ran a shaky hand through his thinning gray hair. He let out a long, ragged sigh and deliberately softened his facial expression. The furious tyrant vanished instantly, replaced by the weary, burdened patriarch. It was a terrifyingly quick emotional pivot, a psychological tool he had used to control my mother for 40 years. He took a step toward me, holding his hands up in a placating, open gesture. "Lydia, honey, listen to me," he said, his voice dropping to a low, soothing register that made my skin crawl. "I am sorry," I yelled. "I am just under an incredible amount of stress right now. It has been a terrible morning. There has been a massive, catastrophic error at the bank. It is a computer glitch. Some faceless algorithm flagged our corporate restructuring as a default and triggered an automated freeze on all our assets." I looked up at him, keeping my eyes wide and entirely innocent. "A computer glitch?" I asked softly. "But you are Richard Wilson. Cannot you just call the bank president and fix it?" He gritted his teeth, an involuntary twitch of anger flashing across his jawline before he forced the benevolent smile back onto his face. "It is not that simple, sweetheart. The banking regulations are incredibly strict right now. It takes time to untangle these bureaucratic nightmares. Days, maybe weeks, to get the freeze lifted. And in the meantime, the logistics company has vendors to pay. We have massive operating expenses that cannot wait for a clerical error to be resolved. The entire family legacy is at risk because of a simple technological mistake." He took another step closer, invading my personal space. The smell of stale alcohol, expensive cologne, and sour, nervous sweat rolled off his skin. He reached out and placed his heavy hands on my shoulders, giving them a firm paternal squeeze. "I need your help, Lydia," he said, looking deeply into my eyes, projecting absolute sincerity. "I know we have had our differences lately. I know your mother and Brittany can be harsh. But you are still a Wilson. You are still my daughter. And right now, the family needs you to step up. I need you to sign over the deed to the mountain cabin today." I let a single tear escape, rolling slowly down my cheek. I looked down at his expensive leather shoes. "But you said you were going to sue me for it. You sent Mother to my office to humiliate me. You threatened to ruin my career and leave me homeless." Richard let out a soft, paternal chuckle, shaking his head, as if dismissing a silly childhood misunderstanding. "That was just noise, Lydia. It was just lawyers posturing. You know how Caldwell gets. He is a bulldog. I never truly intended to leave you out in the cold. It was just tough love trying to make you see reason. But we do not have time for legal games anymore. I have a private buyer lined up for the cabin property. A cash buyer. If you sign the deed transfer this morning, I can liquidate the asset by noon and inject the cash directly into the logistics firm to keep us afloat until the bank fixes their ridiculous error. He squeezed my shoulders tighter, his grip bordering on painful. His thumbs dug into my collarbones. Think about it, Lydia. You can save the family. You can be the hero for once in your life. You have always wanted to be important. This is your chance. If you do this for me, I will personally forgive all your recent insubordination. We will drop the lawsuit entirely. I will tell Caldwell to back off. I will even let you keep that old sedan of yours without any further argument. You will not have to worry about expensive lawyers or evictions or living on the streets. Everything can go back to normal. We can be a happy family again. All you have to do is be a good daughter and sign the papers so I can fix this mess. It was a breathtaking display of manipulation. He was actively drowning in toxic debt entirely of his own making, and yet he was still trying to frame the theft of my property as a generous concession. He was offering to let me keep my own car as a reward for surrendering my only valuable asset. He was offering me the privilege of remaining his emotional punching bag in exchange for saving his fraudulent empire. I needed him to keep talking. I needed him to dig the hole so deep there would be absolutely no possibility of climbing out. I needed him on the record. I gently pulled away from his grasp, letting my shoulders shake with perfectly timed silent sobs. I turned my back to him, wrapping my arms around myself, and walked slowly toward the small kitchen island, separating the living space from the kitchen. I cannot do it, Dad. I whispered, my voice trembling with manufactured grief. I cannot just give it away. It is everything I have. Richard followed me, his heavy footsteps sounding loud on the hardwood floor. Lydia, stop being difficult. He snapped, his benevolent facade beginning to crack under the pressure of his impending financial doom. You do not even use that cabin. It is sitting empty while the family business is facing a totally unearned crisis. You are being incredibly selfish. I stopped at the kitchen counter. My phone was resting face down next to the coffee maker, exactly where I had placed it after the alarm went off. I rested my hands flat on the cool granite surface, leaning my weight against the counter as if I could no longer support myself. I let my right hand slide casually over the device, concealing it beneath my palm. My thumb found the side button. I pressed it twice, initiating the emergency voice recording shortcut I had configured weeks ago. A faint double vibration pulsed against my skin, confirming the high-definition microphone was active and capturing every word spoken in the room. I slowly turned around to face him. I let the tears flow freely, now my chin trembling as I looked at the man who had tormented me for 3 decades. I channeled every ounce of genuine pain from my childhood, twisting it into the performance of a lifetime. Why are you doing this to me? I asked, my voice cracking with absolute desperation. Why do you always take everything from me and give it to her? You know the cabin is legally mine. Grandfather left it to me. And you know Brittany is stealing from you. Richard froze. The demand for the deed died on his lips. His eyes narrowing into dark, furious slits. What did you just say? I gripped the edge of the granite counter, acting completely broken and defeated. I said, you know Brittany is stealing from you. I whispered, shaking my head sadly. I saw the invoices, Dad. I saw the receipts for the engagement party. She is draining the company accounts to buy white orchids and vintage champagne while you are begging me for my only piece of property. Why are you punishing me for her greed? Why am I always the one who has to bleed so Brittany can shine? The trap was perfectly set. I had challenged his absolute authority. I had insulted his golden child, and I had dared to suggest that he was a clueless victim of his own daughter's manipulation. It was the ultimate, unforgivable insult to a man whose entire identity was built on absolute control and supreme intellectual arrogance. He could not tolerate being perceived as weak or ignorant, especially not by the daughter he considered entirely worthless. He could not maintain the loving, desperate father act for another second. The benevolent mask completely shattered, revealing the cold, calculating monster lurking beneath. Richard let out a harsh, cruel bark of laughter. He took a final step toward me, stopping just inches away. He looked down at me with an expression of such profound and absolute contempt that it would have shattered the old Lydia into a million pieces. Richard let out a harsh, cruel bark of laughter. He took a final step toward me, stopping just inches away. He looked down at me with an expression of such profound and absolute contempt that it would have shattered the old Lydia into a million pieces. The false warmth, the paternal concern, the desperate pleading, it all evaporated in a single breath. The mask was gone, and the monster underneath was finally staring me right in the face. "You are pathetic, Lydia," he sneered, his upper lip curling into a display of pure, unadulterated disgust. "You stand there whining about fairness and crying about what is legally yours, as if any of that actually means anything in the real world. You are 33 years old, and you still think the universe owes you a level playing field." He leaned closer, the hostility radiating off his skin in waves. "It does not matter what is legal, Lydia," he stated, his voice hard and flat. "The law belongs to whoever has the most money. The law belongs to the people who write the checks and own the buildings. And you have nothing. You are nothing. You are a mediocre secretary living in a mediocre box, clinging to a piece of dirt you could never afford to maintain." I kept my head bowed, letting my shoulders tremble violently. I allowed a soft, broken whimpering sound to escape my throat, playing the shattered victim flawlessly. I needed him to feel massive. I needed him to feel like a god. "Do not look at me like that." Richard snapped, his voice dripping with venom. "You want the truth. Fine, I will give you the brutal, honest truth since you seem so desperate for it. Yes, Brittany is bleeding the accounts dry. Yes, she is careless and she is greedy and she makes incredibly expensive mistakes. But do you want to know the difference between you and your sister? Brittany is a winner. She has a brilliant future ahead of her. She is going to marry into one of the most powerful families in Chicago. She is going to elevate this family name, and she is going to carry the Wilson legacy forward into rooms you are not even allowed to clean." He jabbed a thick finger toward my chest. "You, on the other hand, are a dead end. You have always been a dead end. I need that mountain house to cover Brittany's mistakes, because her mistakes are worth fixing. Her future is worth protecting. Yours is not. It is your duty as the lesser daughter to take the fall for this family. You owe us that much for 33 years of profound mediocrity and disappointment." He reached into the inner pocket of his wrinkled tuxedo jacket and pulled out a gold Mont Blanc pen. He slammed it down on the granite counter right next to the deed transfer Caldwell had prepared. The heavy metal clattered loudly against the stone. "I am done playing games with you, Lydia," he stated, his tone cold and absolute. "I am leaving this deed right here on your counter. We have a court hearing tomorrow morning regarding this property dispute. I expect you to walk into that courtroom with this document fully signed and properly notarized, handing the cabin over to me without a single word of protest. If you do not, I swear to God, I will spend every last dime I have left destroying you. I will make sure you never work in this city again. I will bury you in so much legal debt you will be begging to live on the streets." He did not wait for an answer. He did not need one. In his mind, he had already won. He had crushed the rebellion, stomped on the uprising, and put the family scapegoat firmly back in her proper place. He turned on his heel and strode aggressively out of my apartment. The heavy front door slammed shut behind him with a violent finality that rattled the picture frames on the walls. I stood frozen by this kitchen island for exactly 10 seconds, listening to his heavy footsteps recede down the hallway. I waited until I heard the distant electronic chime of the elevator arriving and the mechanical slide of the doors closing. The moment the building fell completely silent, the tears instantly vanished from my eyes. The trembling in my shoulders stopped abruptly. My posture straightened, shifting in a fraction of a second from a cowering, broken victim to a woman standing at the absolute height of her power. My breathing slowed, returning to a calm, steady rhythm. I picked up my phone from the granite counter and hit the stop button on the screen. The audio file rendered, saving itself to the secure encrypted cloud server I had established for this exact purpose. I tapped the playback icon. Richard's arrogant, sneering voice filled my quiet kitchen, crystal clear and perfectly preserved. "It is your duty as the lesser daughter to take the fall." I smiled. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. He had just handed me a recorded confession of financial extortion and profound familial malice. He had willingly documented his intent to defraud me of my legal inheritance to cover up corporate embezzlement. He had driven the final absolute nail into his own coffin, and he had done it with a smile on his face. I did not go back to sleep. I moved through my apartment with cold clinical efficiency. I showered, washed away the physical memory of his presence, and changed into a sharp, tailored charcoal suit. I left my apartment before the sun even began to rise over the Chicago skyline. I took a private car directly to the sleek glass and steel tower that housed Vanguard Acquisitions. As a premier subsidiary of Apex Holdings, Vanguard served as the tactical strike unit for our most aggressive and complex corporate takeovers. It was my designated staging ground for the day. The building was a fortress of wealth and secrecy. The Vanguard offices were completely empty at 5 in the morning. The motion sensor lights flickered to life in a cascading wave as I walked down the long, silent corridors toward my executive suite. The air was cool and smelled faintly of ozone and expensive carpet cleaner. I sat down at my massive glass desk and booted up the secure terminal. It was time to manufacture the ammunition. I spent the next 6 hours meticulously compiling the arsenal that would annihilate the Wilson Empire. The high-speed industrial printers in the secure copy room whirred to life, churning out hundreds of pages of undeniable catastrophic truth. I arranged the documents into 3 massive separate stacks on the polished glass surface of my conference table. The first stack was the financial guillotine. It contained the complete unredacted foreclosure documents from Apex Holdings. It detailed the exact minute the midnight default had triggered the asset seizure protocols. It documented the total freezing of Richard's logistics fleet, his operational capital, and his personal bank accounts. It was the undeniable verified proof that he was entirely destitute. The money he thought he could use to destroy me no longer existed. The second stack was the legal execution. It held the high-resolution photographs of the physical ledgers from the Palmer Suite and the printed emails between Richard and Attorney Caldwell. It was a step-by-step manual of federal pension fraud. It outlined the offshore routing numbers, the fake vendor invoices, and the deliberate conspiracy to loot employee retirement funds. It was the exact paperwork required to send my father to a federal penitentiary and ensure Caldwell was disbarred and publicly disgraced. The third stack was the personal annihilation. It was the certified printed transcripts of the high-definition audio recording I had captured in my kitchen that morning. It documented every cruel extortionist threat Richard had made, perfectly outlining his intent to blackmail me. It laid bare the toxic, rotting core of the Wilson family for any judge or jury to read. I stood over the conference table, running my fingertips lightly across the crisp white edges of the paper. This was not just a legal defense strategy. It was a complete systematic obliteration of everything they held dear. I was taking their money, their reputation, their freedom, and their arrogant belief that they were untouchable. I picked up a single unmarked heavy stock manila folder. I carefully gathered the 3 stacks of paper aligning the edges perfectly and slid them into the folder. I sealed the brass clasp. The folder was heavy. It possessed a dense physical weight that perfectly mirrored the absolute devastation contained inside it. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung open with a slow, deliberate groan. The ambient noise of the hallway faded away as I stepped onto the polished hardwood floor of the gallery. The transition from the cold digital environment of Vanguard Acquisitions to the warm wood-paneled tradition of the municipal courthouse was jarring, but deeply satisfying. The narrative had looped perfectly back to the present moment. The circle was complete. We were back to the exact second this entire operation had been building toward. The courtroom was bright and imposing. The afternoon sun filtered through the high-arched windows, casting long, dramatic shadows across the wooden pews. I walked slowly down the center aisle, my heels clicking softly against the floor. I held the unmarked manila folder loosely at my side. They were already there. Richard sat at the defendant's table wearing a freshly pressed navy suit, his posture radiating supreme, unearned confidence. He believed the bank error was currently being sorted out by his financial team. He believed he had successfully broken my spirit this morning in my kitchen. Beside him, Attorney Caldwell leaned back in his leather chair, whispering something to Richard with a smug, greasy smile. Caldwell believed his pathetic threats in the Palmer Suite had completely neutralized me. Behind them, sitting in the first row of the gallery, My mother and Brittany watched the proceedings with expressions of profound boredom. Patricia wore her signature pearls, looking slightly annoyed that she had to endure the smell of a public building. Brittany was checking her phone, her perfectly manicured fingers flying across the screen, entirely unconcerned with the legal theater happening around her. They all believed this was a simple temporary formality. They thought this was a quick legal slaughter before a celebratory late lunch at the country club. I reached the plaintiff's table and took my seat. I placed the heavy manila folder on the smooth wooden surface directly in front of me. I folded my hands calmly on top of it. Richard caught my eye from across the aisle. He offered a small, condescending smirk and tapped his breast pocket, a silent, arrogant reminder of the unsigned deed he fully expected me to surrender to the judge. Caldwell did not even bother to look at me, projecting total, absolute dismissal of my presence. I did not look away. I held Richard's gaze, my expression perfectly flat and entirely serene. I let a slow, cold smile touch the corners of my mouth. The bailiff stepped forward, clearing his throat loudly, as the heavy wooden door behind the high mahogany bench opened. "All rise." The bailiff called out, his powerful voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings. "Court is now in session." The trap was completely sprung. The heavy doors at the back of the courtroom were locked shut. The predators were happily sitting inside the cage, and they had absolutely no idea that the prey had already swallowed the key. Judge Harrison took her seat at the high mahogany bench. She adjusted her reading glasses and looked down at the daily docket. The courtroom was vast and quiet, filled with the scent of old wood and the soft hum of the central air conditioning system. I sat perfectly still at the plaintiff's table, my hands resting lightly on the heavy manila folder. Across the aisle, Richard was practically vibrating with impatient arrogance. He straightened his expensive silk tie and offered me a final mocking smirk. He was fully prepared to watch me surrender my home and walk out of the building with absolutely nothing. He thought the midnight freeze on his accounts was a temporary computer glitch that his accountants were currently resolving. He had no idea the executioner was already in the room. Attorney Caldwell stood up, smoothing the front of his custom-tailored suit. He projected the effortless, greasy confidence of a man who believed he owned the legal system. "Your Honor, we anticipate a very brief and efficient proceeding this morning," he announced, his voice booming across the silent courtroom. "We have a simple property dispute regarding a mountain cabin. I believe the defendant has recognized the futility of her position and is prepared to formally surrender the signed deed to my client right now. We can resolve this matter immediately and save the court valuable time." Caldwell turned and looked at me expectantly, holding out his hand as if waiting for me to pass him a piece of paper. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms over his chest, with a deeply satisfied sigh. Behind them in the gallery, I could hear Brittany whispering something to my mother, followed by a soft, cruel giggle. I did not reach for a pen. I stood up, pushing my chair back slowly. The legs scraped against the polished hardwood floor, breaking the expectant silence. "I have no such intention, Your Honor," I stated, my voice perfectly calm and echoing clearly through the large, imposing room. "I do, however, have a critical motion to file with the court this morning." Caldwell rolled his eyes, letting out a loud, theatrical sigh of annoyance. "Your Honor, I object. This is a blatant stall tactic. The defendant is entirely out of options and is deliberately attempting to waste the court's time with frivolous filings. She has no legal standing to contest the ownership of the property." I picked up the heavy, unmarked manila folder from the table. I held it out toward the bailiff. "I strongly suggest you allow the judge to review the filing before you make any further assumptions regarding my legal standing, Mr. Caldwell," I said, keeping my tone conversational and pleasant. Judge Harrison frowned, looking down at Caldwell with a stern expression. "I will determine what is frivolous in my courtroom, counselor," she said sharply. She nodded to the bailiff, who quickly walked over, took the folder from my hands, and carried it up to the bench. The courtroom held its breath as Judge Harrison broke the brass clasp and opened the folder. She adjusted her glasses and began to read the top document. The initial look of routine boredom on her face vanished within seconds. Her posture stiffened. She leaned forward, gripping the edges of the paper, her eyes scanning the dense legal text with sudden, intense focus. She flipped to the second page, and then the third, verifying the digital seals and the notarized signatures. The silence in the room grew heavy and suffocating. Caldwell shifted uncomfortably, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He glanced nervously at Richard, who was suddenly frowning, his confident smirk faltering as he watched the judge's deeply serious expression. "This is highly irregular," Judge Harrison finally said, breaking the silence. She looked up over the rim of her glasses, her gaze locking directly onto Richard. "Mr. Wilson, your attorney stated that this was a simple property dispute. However, the documentation I am holding completely nullifies your ability to pursue this or any other civil action." Richard stood up, his face flushing red. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, gripping the edge of the defense table. "I have every right to take back that cabin. She is stealing from me." Judge Harrison slammed her wooden gavel down hard, silencing him instantly. "You will speak when spoken to in this courtroom, Mr. Wilson," she reprimanded, her voice cracking like a whip. She picked up the top document, holding it up for the room to see. "I am reading this motion aloud for the court record. This document is not a defense against the property lawsuit. It is a formal, verified notification from federal banking authorities that the plaintiff entity, known as the Wilson Family Trust, including all associated corporate logistics holdings, is currently in active federal bankruptcy receivership." Richard let out a loud, barking laugh. "That is completely absurd," he shouted, throwing his hands in the air. "My company is perfectly solvent. I have millions in operating capital. This woman is handing you fabricated documents." Judge Harrison ignored his outburst entirely. She continued reading from the official file, her voice ringing with absolute finality. "As of midnight last night, a catastrophic and uncured default was registered on a consolidated commercial debt portfolio. The mandatory grace period has officially expired. Consequently, all operating accounts, corporate credit lines, and physical assets belonging to the plaintiff have been permanently frozen and seized by the primary holding company. You are entirely bankrupt, Mr. Wilson." The color drained from Richard's face. His aggressive posture collapsed. He looked at Caldwell, his eyes wide and panicked, silently begging his lawyer to fix the situation. But Caldwell was staring at the judge, his mouth hanging slightly open, his legal mind racing to comprehend the sheer scale of the financial devastation being described. "It gets significantly worse for you, Mr. Wilson." Judge Harrison continued, flipping to the next verified page. "The court formally acknowledges the presence of the legally appointed trustee, representing the holding company, that now maintains absolute undisputed ownership of all your frozen assets and corporate entities." The judge slowly lowered the documents and looked directly at me. She addressed the entire courtroom, but her eyes remained locked on mine. "The court recognizes the primary creditor and executive trustee of Apex Holdings, Miss Lydia Wilson." The absolute shock in the room was a physical force. It hit the defense table like a shockwave. Richard stumbled backward, his knees hitting his chair. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked at me, then back to the judge, then back to me, his brain simply unable to process the terrifying reality that his invisible, quiet daughter was the apex predator who had just swallowed his entire empire whole. In the gallery behind him, my mother let out a sharp, strangled gasp, dropping her expensive leather handbag onto the floor where the contents spilled across the wood. Caldwell realized his own survival was suddenly at stake. He slammed his fist onto the table, trying to regain control of the narrative through sheer volume and intimidation. "Your Honor, this is a massive, fraudulent conspiracy," he yelled, pointing a shaking finger at me. "This woman is a disgruntled, estranged daughter, attempting to extort her own father through manipulated banking records. I demand she be sanctioned, taken into custody, and investigated for corporate espionage immediately." I did not panic. I did not flinch. I let Caldwell finish his desperate little speech. Then I picked up the second stack of papers from my table. I walked slowly across the center aisle, stepping right up to the defense table. Richard shrank back into his chair, but Caldwell stood his ground, glaring at me with raw hatred. I slapped the thick stack of printed emails and high-resolution photographs directly onto the wood right in front of Caldwell's hands. "If you proceed with this civil suit, Mr. Caldwell," I said, keeping my voice low, steady, and completely terrifying, I am legally obligated as the primary creditor and executive trustee of my father's seized estate to report you directly to the Bar Association and the Securities and Exchange Commission for facilitating and orchestrating massive federal pension fraud. Caldwell froze. He looked down at the top page resting on the table. It was a printed email showing his exact signature block, providing detailed instructions on how to route the stolen retirement funds into the Cayman Islands shell accounts. Beneath it was a photograph of the physical ledger he had carelessly left on Richard's desk, detailing the fake vendor invoices used to wash the stolen money. I watched the realization hit him. He saw his entire life flashing before his eyes. He saw the federal indictments, the prison sentence, the total destruction of his lucrative career. He physically recoiled from the table, jerking backward as if the stack of paper was actively radiating heat. The smug, arrogant lawyer vanished completely, leaving behind a terrified, sweating coward. "Caldwell, do something!" Richard hissed, grabbing his attorney's arm, his voice dripping with desperation. "Object to this. Tell the judge she is lying. Shut her down right now." Caldwell violently yanked his arm away from Richard's grasp. He stood up so fast his heavy leather chair tipped backward and crashed onto the floor. He did not bother to pick it up. He grabbed his briefcase, his hands trembling so badly he could barely grip the leather handle. He looked at Richard with absolute disgust and raw panic. "Your Honor." Caldwell stammered, his voice a high-pitched, frantic squeak that echoed pitifully through the quiet room. "Due to sudden, unforeseen, and completely irreconcilable conflicts of interest, I must immediately withdraw as counsel for the plaintiff. I request permission to be excused from this courtroom." Richard stared at him in total disbelief. "What are you doing?" he shouted, grabbing Caldwell's sleeve. "You work for me. You fix this. Sit back down." "Permission granted, Mr. Caldwell." Judge Harrison said, her eyes narrowing as she watched the chaotic surrender happening at the defense table. Caldwell did not look at Richard. He did not look at me. He turned and practically sprinted up the center aisle. He shoved past the heavy wooden swinging doors at the back of the courtroom, abandoning his client, his reputation, and his entire professional life to save himself. The heavy doors swung shut behind him, leaving a vacuum of stunned, absolute silence in his wake. Richard stood completely alone at the defense table. He looked around the large, imposing room. He looked up at the judge sitting on the bench. He looked back at his wife and his golden child sitting frozen in the gallery. And finally he looked at me. The brutal reality of his situation was finally penetrating the thick, rotting armor of his narcissism. He was not just facing a temporary bank error. He had been completely outmaneuvered, systematically dismantled, and stripped of every single asset he possessed by the daughter he had spent 33 years calling a pathetic failure. "Your Honor." Richard started, his voice weak, shaking, and stripped of all its commanding authority. "There has been a terrible mistake. My accounts, my company, my entire life, I built it from nothing. You cannot just let her take it. She is a thief. She is stealing my legacy." Judge Harrison picked up her wooden gavel. Her expression was cold and entirely devoid of any sympathy. "There is no mistake, Mr. Wilson. The documentation provided to this court is verified, binding, and absolute. You do not possess the legal standing, the financial solvency, or the authority to pursue this or any other civil action regarding the mountain property. The corporate entity you represent is entirely bankrupt and has been legally seized by the holding company. You have nothing left to fight with." She raised the gavel high above the sounding block. "This case is dismissed with prejudice." The wooden mallet slammed down. The sharp crack echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. It was the absolute, undeniable sound of an empire collapsing into dust. Richard's knees buckled. He fell heavily back into his chair. His hands gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning stark white. He began to hyperventilate, drawing in short, rapid, gasping breaths that sounded like a dying engine. His chest heaved erratically, and a thick sheen of cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He was staring blindly at the wood, completely paralyzed by the catastrophic reality of his total financial ruin. In the gallery behind him, the silence finally shattered. Brittany let out a piercing, hysterical scream. It was not a scream of grief or concern for her father. It was a scream of pure, selfish, unimaginable panic. The realization had finally hit her. She realized the platinum credit cards were gone. She realized the country club memberships, the designer clothes, the lavish engagement parties, and the massive, untouchable inheritance she had been banking on her entire life had just vanished into thin air. She clutched her expensive hair, sobbing uncontrollably, stomping her high heels against the floor like a spoiled toddler throwing a massive tantrum. Patricia sat frozen beside her, staring blankly at the wall, completely unable to comprehend that she was now entirely destitute. The bailiff quickly ushered them out of the courtroom. The heavy wooden doors swung shut behind us, sealing their fate with a dull, echoing thud. We stood in the long, expansive corridor of the municipal courthouse. The polished marble floors reflected the harsh fluorescent lighting overhead, casting pale, sickly shadows across their faces. Richard leaned heavily against the cold stone wall, staring blankly down at his own expensive leather shoes. His breathing was still ragged and shallow. He looked like a man who had just survived a terrible catastrophic collision, only to realize he was hopelessly paralyzed. Patricia clung to his arm, her perfectly styled hair beginning to unravel from the sheer physical tremor shaking her entire body. Brittany was pacing frantically a few feet away. She was swiping at her tear-streaked face with the back of her hand, leaving dark, messy smudges of expensive mascara across her cheekbones. Her designer purse hung limply from her shoulder, no longer a status symbol, but just a heavy bag. Suddenly, the sharp, high-pitched chime of her cell phone echoed loudly in the quiet hallway. She practically lunged for it, her eyes wide with desperate, frantic hope. Perhaps it was a mistake. Perhaps one of her wealthy friends was calling to rescue her from this nightmare. She unlocked the screen. I stood close enough to watch the exact second her world completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The message was from her fiancé. His family was old money, deeply embedded in the elite Chicago financial sector. News of a federal bankruptcy receivership and an impending criminal investigation for corporate pension fraud did not take days to circulate among their social class. It took minutes. Brittany let out a choked, gasping noise. Her hands began to shake so violently she nearly dropped the device. He canceled it. She whispered, her voice cracking and thin. He canceled the wedding. He says his father refuses to let their family name be associated with a federal criminal investigation. She looked up at Patricia, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated agony. He wants the ring back, Mother. He told me to give the ring to his lawyer by tomorrow morning, or he will have me arrested for grand larceny. She looked down at her left hand. The massive, flawless diamond that she had spent months shoving into my face suddenly looked like a heavy iron shackle. It was no longer a symbol of her elite, guaranteed future. It was a ticking time bomb connecting her to a man who now despised her. She ripped the ring off her finger, her chest heaving with fresh, hysterical sobs, and shoved it deep into her purse. She slid down the marble wall until she hit the floor, burying her face in her knees, weeping uncontrollably. I adjusted my grip on the manila folder and took a step toward the exit. The slight movement caught Patricia's attention. She snapped her head toward me. The arrogant, dismissive woman who had sat in my living room demanding my obedience just hours ago was entirely gone. In her place was a terrified, desperate shell of a person, realizing for the first time in her pampered life that there was no safety net to catch her fall. She lunged forward, closing the distance between us in two frantic strides. She grabbed my forearm with both hands, her manicured nails digging painfully into the fine fabric of my charcoal suit. Her face was inches from mine, wet with tears, and contorted with blind, overwhelming panic. "Lydia, please." Patricia sobbed, her voice echoing shrilly down the courthouse corridor, drawing the attention of passing clerks. "You have to stop this. You are the CEO now. You own the holding company. You control all the assets. You can fix this right now. You can just cancel the bankruptcy and give it all back." She was shaking my arm, her grip tightening with a frantic, desperate energy. She looked up at me with wide, pleading eyes. "Think about what you are doing, Lydia," she pleaded, her voice breaking into a high-pitched whine. "You cannot let them take the Oakbrook house. It is our home. Where are we supposed to go? How are we supposed to live? We have absolutely no money. The bank accounts are entirely frozen. You cannot just leave us on the street like common criminals. We are your family, Lydia. We are your blood. You have to save us." It was a fascinating display of complete psychological collapse. For over 3 decades, Patricia had stood by and watched Richard emotionally and financially abuse me. She had actively participated in my alienation, making sure I always knew I was a secondary citizen in my own home. She had treated me like a defective servant whose only purpose was to absorb the negativity of the household. And now, with her entire fake reality burning to the ground, she was shamelessly demanding my loyalty. She actually believed the biological tie she had weaponized against me my entire life would somehow magically compel me to rescue her from a disaster of her own making. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell or display a single ounce of anger or vindictiveness. I looked down at her hands gripping my arm and felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no guilt, no lingering sense of familial obligation. The emotional cord that had bound me to these people had been cut permanently. I reached over with my free hand and calmly pried her fingers off my sleeve one by one. I pushed her hands away, letting my arm drop back to my side. I smoothed the wrinkled fabric of my suit jacket, deliberately creating physical and emotional space between us. I looked directly into her terrified, weeping eyes. "You told me family means making sacrifices for the greater good," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and entirely devoid of warmth. "I am simply following the rules you established for this family." Patricia stared at me, her mouth opening and closing in silent shock, completely unable to formulate a response to her own toxic philosophy being used against her. "My greater good is liquidating every single one of your assets to pay back the innocent employees whose pension funds your husband stole." I continued, my tone as cold and hard as the marble floor beneath our feet. "The Oakbrook mansion no longer belongs to you. The cars, the jewelry, the art collection, it all belongs to the Apex Holding Trust now. You have exactly 24 hours to vacate my property. If you or Richard or Brittany are found on the premises after that time, I will have you forcibly removed by law enforcement for criminal trespassing." I did not wait for a response or another plea. I turned my back on them and walked away. I did not look over my shoulder as I pushed through the heavy glass exit doors and stepped out into the bright, crisp Chicago afternoon. I left them standing in the cold hallway to face the absolute ruin of their own making. The dismantling of this Wilson empire was executed with surgical precision over the following weeks. Richard never recovered from the shock. His logistics company was immediately dissolved by the bankruptcy courts. Every truck, every warehouse, every corporate contract was liquidated at public auction to satisfy the massive debts he had accumulated. The federal authorities did not show him any mercy. The evidence of pension fraud was undeniable and comprehensive. He was indicted on multiple counts of federal embezzlement and wire fraud. His days of sipping vintage champagne at the Drake Hotel were permanently replaced by humiliating public court appearances and meetings with overworked public defenders, trying to negotiate a plea deal that would keep him out of a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. Caldwell faced a similar absolute destruction. The Bar Association moved swiftly upon receiving the documented evidence of his complicity in the corporate fraud. He was formally disbarred, stripped of his license to practice law, and publicly disgraced in the legal community. The SEC seized his personal assets, freezing his accounts, and leaving the arrogant bulldog lawyer entirely ruined, and facing his own separate federal charges for financial conspiracy. Brittany was forced to face the real world without her platinum credit cards or her father's toxic financial protection. With her engagement shattered, and her socialite friends instantly blocking her number upon hearing the news, she had no choice but to find employment to survive. The girl who used to spend her afternoons trying on $1,000 shoes was now working a minimum wage retail job at a discount clothing store in a strip mall. She had to take the public bus to get to her shifts. She spent her days folding cheap sweaters, sweeping floors, and enduring the complaints of angry, demanding customers, her feet aching in cheap shoes, her designer dreams completely reduced to ash. Patricia suffered perhaps the most agonizing fate for a woman obsessed with social status. Driven out of the Oakbrook mansion, she was forced to move into a cramped, noisy one-bedroom apartment in a rundown neighborhood located right next to an elevated train line. The deafening rattle of the commuter trains shook her thin walls every 20 minutes, day and night. She tried reaching out to her old friends, seeking charity or a place to stay, but she was completely shunned by the country club elite she had spent her life trying to impress. She became a social ghost, ignored and entirely forgotten by the very people she had valued over her own daughter. I sat on the wide wooden porch of my mountain cabin, letting the crisp, clean morning air fill my lungs. The sun was just beginning to rise over the distant pine tree line, casting a brilliant golden glow across the calm mirror-like surface of the lake below. I held a steaming mug of dark roast coffee in both hands, feeling the comforting heat seep into my palms. The silence of the mountain was profound and beautiful. My phone vibrated gently on the small wooden table next to my chair, breaking the quiet. I picked it up, checking the caller identification on the screen. It was David, my senior business partner at Vanguard Acquisitions. I swiped to answer, placing the phone against my ear. "We just closed the restructuring deal on the downtown tech sector, Lydia," David said, his voice bright with professional satisfaction and genuine respect. "The acquisition was completely successful. We are officially expanding the portfolio by 30% this quarter, and the initial projections look incredibly promising." "Excellent work, David," I replied, taking a slow, savoring sip of my coffee. "Process the integration protocols and initiate the new hiring phase. I will review the final contracts when I return to the office on Monday morning." I ended the call and set the phone back down on the table. I leaned back in my comfortable wooden chair, smiling as I watched the morning light dance across the rippling water. I took a deep breath of the mountain air. I was completely at peace. I had fought the hardest, most painful battle of my life against the people who were supposed to protect me, and I had won. I had successfully secured my future, my sanity, and my life from the very monsters who had tried to destroy it. The story of Lydia's triumph over her toxic family teaches us a profound lesson about the true nature of power and the absolute necessity of setting boundaries. For decades, Richard and Patricia weaponized the concept of family to demand blind loyalty, treating Lydia not as a daughter, but as a disposable asset to be sacrificed whenever it was convenient. They believed that emotional abuse, financial manipulation, and raw intimidation made them untouchable. However, true strength does not scream, and it does not rely on degrading others. Lydia's victory was born in the shadows of their arrogance. While they spent their time posturing and squandering their legacy, she quietly built her own empire. She understood that financial independence is the ultimate shield against extortion. More importantly, she learned that sharing DNA with someone does not obligate you to absorb their toxicity or pay for their crimes. When the breaking point finally arrived, Lydia did not resort to hysterics or empty threats. She let her father's supreme narcissism blind him to his own downfall, patiently capturing his malice as irrefutable evidence. She proved that the most devastating revenge against abusers is simply holding them strictly accountable for their own actions while remaining entirely unbothered by their panic. Walking away from the people who are supposed to love you can be agonizing, but protecting your peace, your future, and your integrity is always worth the cost. You are never obligated to set yourself on fire just to keep toxic relatives warm. Share your own experiences of establishing firm boundaries and breaking free from manipulative family members in the comments below. If Lydia's journey to ultimate justice resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of strength, survival, and taking back your power.